Hi, my name is Max, and in this course I will teach you Next.js, an amazing framework for React.js. And that can be strange because React already is a library, so why do we need a framework for it? I will of course explain that, and in this course we're also going to build a complete project with Next.js, and we're going to learn all the key features that make up Next.js, how it pre-renders pages, how that helps us with search engine optimization, how we implement data fetching, how we work with API routes, and many other important features. And therefore, let's start with the most important question first. What exactly is Next.js and why do we need it?
So, what is Next.js? And why could learning Next.js be a good idea? And why could Next.js in general be helpful to us as a React developer? If we visit nextjs.org, the official Next.js website, we learn that Next.js is the React framework for production. Okay, so that sounds like a good argument. We all want to build production apps, right? So Next.js is certainly helpful then, but wait a second. What exactly does this mean? So Next.js calls itself a React framework for production, and that name makes a lot of sense because Next.js offers a lot of features that make building large-scale production-ready React apps easier. But I personally also like to call Next.js a full-stack framework for React.js. And it's the full-stack part which I want to highlight here. But I will come back to that. Let's first of all focus on the framework part. Isn't React.js itself already a framework or a library? Well, indeed it is. React is labeled a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And that means that it's a third-party package which you can add to your front-end projects. So it's all about client-side JavaScript code in the end. And you can use React there to build interactive user interfaces, and it's a library that makes building complex user interfaces way easier than it would be with just JavaScript. I got separate courses and videos on React where I explain why React is awesome, so I'll not focus on this here. So React already is such a library. And it's called a library because in its core, it's really only focusing on that user interface part, on components, state, props. If you want to build large-scale React projects, you typically also need to add extra libraries for routing, maybe libraries that help you with authentication, and things like that. Now, Next.js is labeled a framework, and a framework that builds up on React. Now, the difference between a framework and a library in the end is that a framework is bigger. It has more features than a library. It's focusing on more things instead of just a single thing. And it's also giving you clear rules, a clear guidance on how you should write your code, how you should structure your files, and so on. And all these are things which Next.js does, as you're going to learn throughout this course. But it's also a framework building up on another library already, on React, because it enhances React, you could say. It makes building large-scale React apps easier. And that's the part where we're back on this for production part here. Next.js has the goal to make the life easier for you as a React developer. And it builds up on React, it enhances React by adding many core features which you have to add to React apps on your own otherwise. Things like routing, but also many other things, and I'll come back to that in just a second, and we're going to dive into the key features added by Next.js. But Next.js simply adds a lot of features to your React app. They then are there out of the box once you start using Next.js, and it therefore ensures that you don't have to reinvent the wheel as often. You don't have to add as many third-party libraries to solve common problems which you need in bigger apps and which you typically need to solve when building real production React apps. And that's why Next.js is called a framework, because it has a lot of features, clear rules. Why it's a framework for React, because it builds up on React, it enhances React, it uses React, you still write React code, you still build React components, but it's a framework for production because it adds all those missing features which you typically do need to add to React apps to really prepare them for production and to solve common problems. And with that, let's now take a closer look at the actual features added by Next.js so that we understand where it helps us exactly and why using it is a great idea and makes our life easier. So let's have a look at the Next.js key features and benefits. And whilst we go through them, it will also become clearer why I like to call Next.js a full-stack framework as well. I would say the most important key feature Next.js adds is the built-in server-side rendering support. Now, in case it's not clear what server-side rendering means, server-side rendering is all about preparing the content of a page on the server instead of on the client. If you take a standard React application built with just React, then if you inspect the source code of a loaded React page, you will notice that the page is actually pretty empty right from the start. You only have a basic HTML skeleton there, and then some entry point, some div with an ID root typically, into which the React app is loaded and rendered. But all of that rendering is done by React, and since React is a client-side JavaScript library, all that rendering happens on the client. So in the browsers of your users, it's not happening on the server. And as a result, the actual HTML code, which is sent from the server to the client when a user visits your page, is pretty empty. Now, that is not necessarily a big problem. It depends on what you're building, but it can be a problem. Because, for example, if your page also fetches some data from a server that should be displayed, like a list of meetups as we're doing it here, then the user might initially see some loading state, a flickering page for a fraction of a second whilst the request is on its way fetching the data, because data fetching only begins once the JavaScript code executed on the client, and then we still have to wait for the response of that outgoing request. Simply because the page which we requested did not yet contain that data. Now again, that is not necessarily a problem, but of course it might not be the user experience you want to offer. Now it can also be a problem if search engine optimization matters to you. Now this does not matter for all pages. If you have an administration dashboard, which is only reached by logging in, then search engine optimization does not matter there because search engines will never see that dashboard. It's highly user-specific and you need to log in anyways. But if you have a public-facing page with a lot of content that should be found through search engines, then of course search engine optimization does matter. So for example here, where we got this list of meetups, we see those meetups as a user, but the search engine crawlers will actually only see that initially empty HTML page which we're getting from a server. So that content is not picked up by search engine crawlers, and that can be a problem. And that's where server-side rendering could help us. If that page would be pre-rendered on the server, if that data fetching somehow could be done on the server when a request hits that server, and then the finished page would be served to our users and to the search engine crawlers, then users would not have that flickering loading state, and search engines would see our page content. And that's the problem server-side rendering solves. It allows us to pre-render React pages, React components on a server. Now, React.js actually has built-in features that allow you to add server-side rendering, but it can be tricky to get that right, and it requires extra setup from your side. With Next.js, that becomes way easier because Next.js has built-in server-side rendering. It automatically pre-renders your pages. And that means that with Next.js, if you build a standard Next.js app without any extra setup from your side, if you visit such a page, it was pre-rendered on the server by default out of the box. And that means that it's great for search engine optimization, because search engines see what our users see, and our users also have a better initial load experience because they don't have that initial flickering. If we inspect the source code of a Next.js page, so of a page in a Next.js app, then we see that there, it's not just an empty HTML skeleton, but instead all the content is already there in that HTML page, which we got back from the server. Now, it is worth noting that with Next.js, after this initial load, after this initial request, we still get a standard React app running in the browser, a standard single-page application even. Subsequent navigation actions by the user, so when the user then browses our page and navigates around, those actions are all handled by React in the browser to have this fast, interactive user experience which we typically want to offer with React, which was one of the reasons why you would use React typically. So we still get that, but for the initial load, we have that pre-rendered page. And that in the end means that client-side and server-side code is kind of blended together with Next.js. And of course, in this course, you are going to learn how things are blending together, how you can write code that runs on the server and how you can write code that runs on the client. You are, of course, going to learn all about that. And this is therefore one of the major features that makes up Next.js, this built-in server-side rendering, which on its own probably would already be a strong benefit or a strong reason for why you might want to use Next.js for building your React projects instead of just React.js. But it's not the only key feature. Another very nice feature added by Next.js is file-based routing. Now, what does this mean? In traditional React, you don't even have a router. And just to be clear, routing means that we give the user the illusion of having multiple pages. When we navigate around and we load different pages, then that's the job of a router. Typically, we use React Router for that. This router basically watches the URL, and when it changes, it basically prevents the browser default of sending a request to some backend server, and instead renders different content on the page with React, a different component in the end. That's what routing is. We change what's visible on the screen based on the URL without sending an extra request to a server, because we stay in that single page application which we typically build with React. Now that's routing, and typically with React, routing is set up in code. That code could look something like this, depending on the version of React Router you're using. Now this works, and it's not bad, not wrong. React Router is a great package, but it is extra code which you have to write. And then often you end up storing your components that act as pages in a separate folder, which kind of replicates your route setup in code. So if you have 3 pages set up as pages in code, you have 3 page components in that pages component folder. Makes sense, I guess. Now, since that's the case, Next.js gets rid of that in-code route definition. Instead, with Next.js, you define pages and routes with files and folders. You have a special pages folder in Next.js apps, which has to be named pages, and then your structure in that folder defines the routes and paths your page supports. And of course, we're also going to learn how that works in this course. Now, that simply allows us to get rid of that extra code, and hence we have to write less code, we have less work, and it's a highly understandable concept because it's very close to how we all started with web development. When you're getting started with just HTML and CSS and some basic JavaScript maybe, then you build basic websites by adding multiple HTML files and the names of these files or the folders in which they sit define how you can navigate between these files, how you can link these files together. And Next.js basically allows us to go back to this very basic yet understandable concept of routing. And Next.js still supports all the features we might want, like nested routes or dynamic routes with dynamic parameters and all of that. And we're going to see that in this course, of course. Now, Next.js has more amazing features, but the last key feature, which I want to point out here, is the feature which is most important for me labeling Next.js a full-stack framework. Because Next.js also makes it easy for us as a developer to add backend code to our React project. So to build a full-stack React project where we don't just have the client-side code, maybe with server-side pre-rendering, but where we also have standalone backend code that, for example, works with the file system or reaches out to a database. With Next.js, it's very easy to add our own backend API into our React project using Node.js code. So we can easily add such code to our next React apps when using Next.js. And that allows us to add code for storing data to a database or to files, getting data from there, adding authentication, and all of that. That's easy to add with Next.js. We can stay in one project. We have to know some Node.js code for that, arguably, but we would have to know that anyways when we build our own backend. And then we don't have to build a standalone REST API project, but instead we can work on one project, our next project, and add all the client-side code, our React user interface, and also blend in our backend API code. That's why Next.js is amazing. And these are all the core features I wanted to point out here, and which we're of course going to learn about in depth in this course, and even more than that. So now that we know what Next.js is, and now that we at least have a first idea of why we might want to use Next.js, let's get started with it and let's create a first Next.js project. For this, we just need to run one simple command in the end, this command here, but to run this command, we need to have Node.js installed. Now, we're not going to write any Node.js code, at least not right now. We will write some basic code later, but we'll not write it right now. But Node.js ships together with the Node Package Manager, which is an extra tool, which is the de facto standard tool for installing and managing libraries in JavaScript projects. And we will use that tool to create the next project. And that created next project under the hood will also need Node.js to execute. For example, for that built-in server-side rendering, that uses Node.js under the hood. And for all those reasons, we need to install Node.js. And for that, you can simply visit nodejs.org, and from that page, you can install the latest version of Node.js, whatever that version is when you're viewing that. Just install the latest version, simply click on there and download Node.js. It is available for all major operating systems, and then walk through that installer once that download finished. Now, once you have Node.js installed, you are ready to run this command, and therefore we can now go to the terminal, to your regular command prompt, which is built into your operating system, and there you can cd and navigate into the folder where you want to create your next project, and then simply run this command, npx create-next-app. Run this command by hitting enter, and this will now create a new next project in that folder where you ran that command. Now, you might be prompted to confirm that you're installing extra packages, and hence I will confirm this here. And now this will temporarily install the Create Next App tool and then start creating that project. Now for this, we first of all need to give this project a name. And I'll just use NextJS-course here as a name, but you can of course pick any name you want. Hit enter, and now this project will be created here, and it will set up a base folder for that project and install all the core dependencies this project will need. Now, once it's done, you can run the commands shown here to start your development server, but I will not yet do that here. Instead, I now opened this project in Visual Studio Code, the IDE, the editor I'm going to use in this course. Now you don't have to use Visual Studio Code. It is a great IDE for web development though. It's completely free and it's amazing, but you can use whatever your favorite web development IDE is. If you do want to use the same editor as I do here though, you can visit code.visualstudio.com, and from there you can download Visual Studio Code. It is available for all major operating systems. Simply download the installer and walk through it. And once you have downloaded and installed it, you can open that Next.js course folder, which we created with the command here in the terminal with Visual Studio Code. Now here I'm using the dark theme. You can change this under Preferences, Color Theme. Here I am using the dark plus theme. And I also adjusted the appearance. You can do that under View, Appearance, and simply adjust it as you want. And for example, show or hide the status bar. I'm hiding it, but that is something you can configure however you want. Now regarding extensions, that's a great feature of Visual Studio Code. You can install extensions there. And the only extension that I'm using here and that I recommend that you install is the Prettier extension. You can simply search for Prettier here. And that's an extension that will help you with code formatting. So with automatically transforming your code to look cleaner and to be more formatted and structured. Once you installed that extension, you just need to make sure that you go to your keyboard shortcuts and there search for Format Document and make sure that you have that shortcut set up, because that's a shortcut which I will press all the time, which will then auto-format my code and use Prettier. And to make sure that I do use Prettier, under Preferences Settings in your user or workspace, so project-specific settings, you can also search for Format and make sure that under Default Formatter, you do pick Prettier here. Here it is. So with that all set up, you will have the same setup as I do, and that is the setup I will use in this course. That is the setup we will use throughout all the lectures, and it is the setup which we'll now use to dig a bit deeper into this project we just created. So we did create that Next.js project here in the terminal with npx create next app. And that gave us a folder which looks like this, which has this kind of content. Attached, you also find that starting project in case it changes over time or looks slightly different because the starting template was changed, for example. So attached, you find that exact project snapshot which I have here. If you do download the attached snapshot though, there is one extra step you need to go through. You need to open the terminal, and you can use the one built into Visual Studio Code, which is your default terminal, your default command prompt, which ships with your operating system, just already integrated into Visual Studio Code, and conveniently also already navigated into this project folder. So any commands you run here will execute in the context of your project folder. And here you then need to run npm install if you use that attached snapshot, because that will then install all the dependencies of this project as defined here in package.json and store them and their dependencies in the node modules folder. So that's also a folder in which will never work. The three important folders for us here are Pages, Public, and Styles, though Pages is by far the most important one. Styles, as you might guess, holds some style files. We can ignore that for now, we'll work on that soon. And Public simply holds public resources our page might use, something like images, for example. Now, one thing you might see here in public, though, is that unlike in a regular React app, which you, for example, created with Create React App with that extra tool, that there, in a standard React app, you have a index.html file in the public folder. Here in the Next.js app, you don't have that. And the reason for this is that Next.js has this built-in pre-rendering, and whilst it gives you a single-page application, that single page is dynamically pre-rendered when a request reaches the server, so that you do return an initial page with content. That is what I talked about earlier in this course as well, this server-side rendering and the pre-rendering of pages. And hence for us, the pages folder will be the most important folder, because that is where we will set up that file-based routing, and that is therefore the folder which is important for us to define the different pages that should make up our application here. Now let's get started with writing some Next.js code here. And for this, I'll shrink the terminal a little bit. And in this pages folder, we can ignore this _app.js file for the moment. We can delete the API folder in there. And in the styles folder, we can also delete the home module CSS file. We can keep the globals CSS file if we want, though. Now we got this index.js file. And in this file, we in the end just have a standard React component. But to make this even clearer, let's delete this file as well, so that the only remaining file in the pages folder is the _app.js file. And now let's say, to get started with Next.js, we want to build a simple website with 3 kinds of pages. A starting page, let's say, then a news page with a list of news, and then a page for the news details. So when we click on a news item, and we're taken to the full page for that specific news item. And if we wanted to create a structure like this, in Next.js, in the pages folder here, we would create 3 files. The index.js file will be our root page. So if a request reaches our domain /nothing, just index.js will be loaded. That is in line with standard websites, if I may call it like this, where we also have index.html files, which are typically served as root pages if a request just targets /nothing after the domain. And here it's index.js, which will be served if a request reaches just our domain /nothing. Then we might also have a news.js file for requests that reach our domain /news. And that's important. With the exception of the index name, which is a special name, which is served whenever we have a request to just /nothing, the file name will be used as a path name. So news.js, the content in here, the React component in here, would be served for requests to our domain /news, for example. So not news.js, but just news. Then the news.js file would be served. And I'll comment this out to leave that in here. Index.js would be served for just our domain.com /nothing. And I'll come back to the page for a single news item later. For the moment, these are the 2 pages we have. And now what goes in those page files? I mentioned it before. Our standard React component. The React component that should be loaded for that specific page. So here in index.js, we can create a component just as we know it, typically as a function, and we could name this homepage. The component name is up to you. Now you must export this component so that Next.js is able to find it, so to say. And then in this component function, you return JSX code, just as you're used to. You return your JSX code, for example, a h1 tag where we say the homepage. That could be a very simple first page. Of course, we're going to add more meaningful content in a second. Now we can copy this to news.js and add it here. As a side note, if you're wondering why we don't have any import statement like this at the top, where we import React from React, Next.js projects support this modern React setup where you can omit this import and it's added behind the scenes, so to say. And with that, here in the news.js file, we would have the, let's say, news page component, and of course also export the news page, and here we could say the news page. And if we do that, if we add these two pages, then in the terminal, in this integrated terminal here, which is already navigated into this project folder, we can start the development server with npm and run dev. And that development server is given to us by that Next.js project setup. So with npm run dev, we start this development server. Here you see the URL where you can visit your page. And therefore, if I now visit localhost 3000, I see the home page. And if we instead would visit localhost 3000/news, we see the news page. And now what's interesting is that the content is just some dummy content, but if we view the page source here of that loaded page, then we see that in there we don't just have an empty skeleton, but if we look a bit closer, we find the actual page content in here. And that is an important difference to a standard React app where the page is not pre-rendered on the server. This HTML code, which we see here, is the HTML code sent back by the server. And since it contains that content here, that means that the entire page was pre-rendered. And that's why the content ends up in here. And the advantage is that we don't have any flickering on the page whilst we're waiting for it. And in addition, search engines would also see that content here. They see what our users see. And that, of course, can be a great advantage. And this is how we can get started with this file-based routing. And as you see, by looking at the page source, in addition to that file-based routing, we also already use that built-in server-side rendering feature without any extra setup, because it works out of the box. With that, let's now dig a bit deeper and let's see what else we can do here. So now we know about this concept of using files in the pages folder for creating routes, which then load these different components that live in these files. And we also see that this server-side pre-rendering works out of the box. Now let's dig a bit deeper into that file-based routing system though. For example, there is an important alternative you should be aware of when it comes to organizing your files and folders. We got this index.js file, and that loads the root page for /nothing, because it's the index.js file directly in the pages folder. Now for the news page /news, we got the news.js file. We always have an alternative to using such a named file name, so a file named differently than index.js. We could also create a news subfolder in the pages folder, move news.js in there, and then rename it to index.js, using that special index.js file name again. Now this page would still be loaded by visiting our domain.com/news, because we're in the news folder. And that's important. Folders which you create in your pages folder also act as path segments. And it's totally up to you whether you want to go with news.js in the root pages folder or index.js in the news folder. Now it does matter though as soon as you start creating nested paths, and that's what I want to do now. If we want to have a path that is something like news/something important, where something important is the identifier of the specific news item you want to load, then you need to create a file in such a subfolder, because otherwise you can't create such a nested path. After all, we have two segments here. And if we just create files directly in the pages folder, we're limited to one segment, the file name. So therefore, if we want to have such a nested path, so more than one segment, we need to create a subfolder. And then we can also create the root page for that path with index.js, and then create the something important.js file as a sibling file to index.js. So now we have two different pages that start with /news, /news/nothing loads the component in the index.js file. /news/something important will load the component we create in here. Now, of course, here again, we could alternatively also create another nested subfolder, something important, with the index.js file in there. That would again be the alternative to using such a named file name in the news folder. But I hope you get the idea by now. Now with that, I could copy this code from index.js in the news folder and bring it into the something important page here, and then name this detail page maybe, because that should be the page holding the details for a specific news item. And this page would now be loaded for /news/something important. And hence, if we save everything and we visit /news, we see the news page. And if I visit /news/something important, then we see the detail page. So that's how this works. But there is still another important concept which we haven't touched on yet. Creating the detail page like this works until we realize that we probably would have more than one news item on our news site. It would be very realistic that index.js in the news folder should output a list of news items, and then we can click those individual items and we're then taken to the detail pages with the concrete content for the news item we selected. So we use the same page over and over again for different news items, for different content. We would probably fetch the concrete content from some database when a user visits this detail page and then display it on the screen. So it's the same component technically, but with different content. And that's of course a totally realistic, I would even say very common scenario. So hard coding the identifier like something -important like this in the file name is not very realistic. Instead, we want to create a so-called dynamic page where the path segment, the concrete value in the path, can be dynamic. So that it's not just /news/something important, but also /something else or /this course is great, whatever. So that this would be the identifier of a news item, and we have a lot of different identifiers, and we add new use all the time, but we always load the same page no matter what the concrete value here is, but then inside of the page we simply have access to that value in the path so that we can fetch the proper data. And that is something we can implement with dynamic paths. For that, we change the file name here to a different file name, and we use a special syntax which will be understood by Next.js. We use square brackets here in the file name in front of the extension. If you have square brackets in your file name like this tells Next.js that this will be a dynamic page, so that it should be loaded for different values in your path. And then you can add an identifier between those square brackets where the identifier name is totally up to you. Something like news ID, for example, like this. But this, again, is up to you. But you need those square brackets. This then tells Next.js that this page will be loaded for different values. So for example, for something important after /news, but also for any other identifier. And then in a next step, I will show you how you can get access to the concrete value entered here and how you can use that. But let's get there step by step. If we now save this again, if I load this page for /news/this course is great, I see the detail page, but I also see it for something else or anything else we enter after /news. So that is how we can add such a dynamic path here. And that is another key feature of Next.js. It's a feature that allows us to build truly dynamic and flexible websites with Next.js. But how can we now extract the entered path value inside of the component so that we can, for example, then fetch the correct news item from a database, let's say, when a user visits this page? To extract the concrete value entered in the URL when this page is loaded, Next.js gives us a special hook which we can use. a special React hook which we can use in functional components. It also has an alternative for class-based components, a higher order component you can wrap around your component, and I do discuss this in my full Next.js course, but we can ignore that here. Here instead we import from Next, to be precise from Next/router, which is a sub-package of the Next package which exposes routing-specific functionality. And here we get the useRouter hook. It's a regular React hook, just not one built into React, but a custom hook built by the Next team. And we can now call this hook inside of the detail page, simply like this. If we do that, we get access to a router object, and on that router object, we then get certain pieces of data and certain methods, which we can call. Now, for example, we get methods for Programmatic Navigation, but we don't need this here, so we can ignore this for now. But we also get access to the values encoded in the URL, so to the concrete values of these dynamic path segments. And getting access is easy. On this router object, we got this query property, which gives us access to a nested object. And on that query object, we then have the identifier, which we chose between the square brackets as a property name. So in my case, news ID, because that's what I entered here as a file name between the square brackets. And that will then hold the concrete value in the URL for this dynamic segment for which this page was visited. So if we now just console log this for the moment to see what's in there, if I save that and go back and open the developer tools, if we reload, we see undefined first and then something else. Now we see two logs here because that's how useRouter works. It runs immediately when the page is first rendered, and at this point it doesn't yet know what's in the URL, but then once we have that information, the component renders again and we got that concrete value. That is just how that hook works. So the second time it executes, the second time this component is evaluated, we got something else, which is the concrete URL value I entered here. And if I have this course is great, then we would see this here being logged. And that's how we can get access to the concrete data encoded in the URL. Now, why is this helpful? Well, we could, for example, use this now to get our news ID like this. And then if we had a database, if we had some backend API from which we can fetch our news, we could send a request to the backend API here to fetch the news item with news ID. That's what we could do here. I will not do it here because we'll soon dive into data fetching and data storage, and we'll see different approaches we can use there with Next.js. So we are going to take a look at that in detail in a couple of minutes, but we could do this here if we had such a backend API. Now, we don't have it here because that's just a simple dummy app to get started with the file-based routing system, but that is how it would work. And that's how we can build dynamic pages which work for different pieces of data and then can do different things based on different pieces of data. Here we could fetch different news items from a database based on the different IDs for which we visit this page. Now, whilst we're not going to proceed on this detail page for the moment, whilst we're not going to dive into data fetching for the moment, I want to come back to this index.js file in the news folder and talk about navigation. Because currently, I of course always enter URLs in the URL bar manually. And that of course is not how users use our website. Instead, we have links on our website that allow users to navigate around. Hence here on this index.js file in the news page, so on the /news page, we typically don't just want to say the news page, but we might also want to display a list of news items which are then clickable. And to do that, I'll wrap this here in a fragment which I import from React so that we can have adjacent JSX elements and render an unordered list here. And in that unordered list, we could have a list of dummy news items. For example, the Next.js is a great framework article, and then also the something else article, whatever. So we have two news items here, and these should now be clickable and then lead to the news ID page with different IDs, different concrete values encoded in the URL. Now, when we want to build a link, we typically do this by using the anchor tag. We can create an anchor element and wrap our text with that. And then here we can encode the URL to which we want to go. So in this case, if we want to stay on this server, we could say we're going to /news/ and then Next.js is a great framework, if that would be the identifier of this news item. And of course, this list could also be generated dynamically by mapping some array of data into JSX elements. I'm just hard coding it here because for the moment, I want to focus on the navigation feature. So that is how we do construct a link in regular HTML. And if we save this, it also will work. If I go back to the /news page here, we actually don't see that it's a link because in the global CSS file, I basically disabled the default styling that would show you that it's a link. But we can click it. And if I do click it, I am taken to that detail page for that specific value. So that is working. But this is only the second best way of navigating around in a Next.js app. It works, but watch this refresh icon here when I click this link. It briefly turns to a cross and then goes back to the refresh icon. This always signals that the browser sends a new request and gets back a new HTML page. And that all works, but it has a disadvantage. It means that we don't have a single page application here. It means instead that we're always sending a new request to the backend to fetch a new HTML page whenever the user navigates around. And that's not our goal here. It's great that we have those pre-rendered pages so that when a user initially visits our site, some content is there right from the start. And it's also great for search engines. But if a user is on the page already and then navigates around on it, we want to stay in that single page application because that allows us to preserve state across pages and give the user a better, more reactive experience, a better user experience. That, after all, is one of the reasons for using React, that we want to build an interactive UI where we never send a request for a new HTML page, but where we instead update what's on the screen with JavaScript, with React in the end. And we're not doing this here when we create a link like this. Instead, we load a brand new page. We would lose any state we might be storing, any Redux state or context state. All of that would be lost because we load a new page. And we simply don't have a single page application here. Therefore, to stay in that single page application, we need to create the link differently. We need to utilize a special component offered by Next, to be precise, offered by Next/link. That's another sub-package which is responsible for linking, and from there we can import link actually as a default export. So importing the default export like this. This imports the link component from NextLink, and that's a special component which we can use in our JSX code to build links. Using it is simple. You simply use it instead of the anchor tag here. So I replace a with link. We leave the ref attribute, the ref prop, because link expects a ref prop. And that then sets the target destination of that link. It will also then by default render an anchor element. So all that will still work. Our styling will still apply. Yet, if I save and reload, if I now click this and you watch the refresh icon, you see that now this never changes to a cross. Now we instantly go to the second page, and now we go there without fetching a new HTML page. Instead, we are on a single page application, and the visible content on the screen is actually just re-rendered by React. And that's great because that allows us to combine the best of both worlds. We have this highly interactive and reactive single page application here, where we can manage and store state across pages. And yet, if a user would visit this page as an initial page by just entering this URL and hitting enter, we would also be able to return the finished HTML page here. So search engines would also see that finished page if they directly visit it. But if we were on the website already and we just click the link, we stay on that single page app. We stay inside of that single page app. Because link, this special link component, renders an anchor tag, but it watches clicks on those anchor tags. And if you click there, it prevents the browser default of sending a request and getting a new HTML page. Instead, it will load the to-be-loaded component for you and change the URL so that it looks like you changed the page, whilst in reality you stay in that single page application. And hence, for site internal links in a Next.js application, you want to use the link component instead of the anchor tag component, because with that you get the best of both worlds. Now that's it for the very basics of Next.js and especially the file-based routing system. How you can create multiple pages, including dynamic pages, and navigate around. Now Next.js also has a lot to offer when it comes to pre-rendering these pages and when it comes to fetching data for pages. And that's therefore the next content block we're going to dive in this course section. But for that, we're going to leave this dummy news project, which was only there for learning the core basics about file-based routing, and we're going to switch to a different project instead. And for this, I got a brand new project. And this project is about the same idea. It's the same kind of project as we had in the React crash course tutorial, but you don't need to go through that module first. Instead, attached you find a starting project, which I did create with that npx create next app command again, just a bit cleaned up and with some components which I pre-built for you. Simply because these are standard React components, nothing Next.js specific in there yet. We're going to work on them a bit throughout this course, but at the moment they're just basic React components, and since you already know React, I don't want it to bore you by again writing such basic React components. Instead, here we want to focus on the next features and the many cool features Next.js adds, and hence this starting project already has a couple of components which we will use. On the other hand, the pages folder is empty, so that we can again practice this file-based routing and add some pages for this project, and the styles folder also just has some basic styles here. And therefore, we're basically starting from scratch here with a brand new Next.js project, and we're going to build this Meetup application here, which again is kind of similar to what we built in this React tutorial already, but there also are some differences. The application we're going to build is all about having some meetups. And we got a page that allows us to create new meetups, and those meetups will then be sent to some backend and will be stored in some database. That is logic we're going to add throughout this course. And we then have a page where we fetch and display a list of meetups, and that's of course also something we're going to build together. And we then can also visit the detail page of a given meetup to fetch and display the details for that specific meetup. And that will be a dynamic page where different meetup identifiers are encoded in the URL. And therefore, we're going to practice what we briefly touched on already, file-based routing, and we're going to add a bunch of new features where Next.js helps us related to data fetching, but also related to blending backend and frontend code and sending requests to an API, which we will build together in this next project. And therefore, we got plenty of exciting topics to cover. Let's dive in. Now to dive in, I want to start with a couple of pages here. And for this here, I also got my terminal open. First of all, we need to install all dependencies though with npm install, and then we can use npm run dev. And that will start the development server, but of course at the moment I got no pages. And hence we should add some pages. And for this demo application, for this project which we're building here, we will need 3 pages. A starting page, which shows a list of all meetups. Then the new meetup page, which allows us to add a new meetup. And then the meetup detail page, which allows us to show the details for a selected meetup. And hence here in the pages folder, I'll start with the starting page with index.js directly in the pages folder, because you learned that index is this special file name which will be loaded for just /nothing in the given subfolder. And here we're not in a subfolder at all, so index.js will be loaded for our domain.com/nothing. But then we got more pages, for example, a page for adding a new meetup. And hence we could add a new meetup.js file, which then would be loaded for our domain/new meetup. And you did learn over the last minutes that we also have an alternative here. We could also create a new meetup folder instead of the file, move the file in there, and then rename it to index.js. And that would then be loaded in exactly the same way. It's up to you which approach you prefer. You need that subfolder approach if you need nested routes, but we will not have any nested routes here. So in this case, it's really up to you. And I will go for this subfolder approach here. But again, it's your choice. And then we also need this detail page, which we load if a specific meetup was clicked and we want to view the details of that meetup. And for this, we need a dynamic page because, of course, we'll have multiple meetups with different IDs, and the ID should be part of the URL. And then when we load the page, we want to use that ID to fetch and display the appropriate data. And we also learned how this worked. We can create a dynamic page with square brackets and then .js, and then simply use any identifier name of our choice between the square brackets. For example, meetup ID. And here we could also use the subfolder approach. It also is available for dynamic pages. We could also create a folder named meetup ID between square brackets and move that file in there and then name it index.js. And that also works. That's something we haven't seen before, and that's why I'm showing it to you here, because it is also important to be aware of the fact that you can also have dynamic folder names here and then create dynamic nested pages if you need them, or like in this case, one single dynamic page. And with that, we got the page structure we want with those 3 pages, and hence we can now get started working on those pages. We can fill those components with some life, and then also step by step add data fetching and learn how Next.js helps us with that. So for filling those pages with life, I will start with that starting page. So with index.js in the pages folder with this index.js file. In there, we can add our component, for example, the homepage component. And of course, also export that. That's always important. And then we want to return the JSX code that defines this component and that therefore defines what should show up on the page. And here, what should show up in the end is our meetup list component. And that's a component that wants a meetups prop here, which holds a list of meetups, which we then map into a list of JSX elements, where every meetup needs to have an ID, an image, a title, and an address. And hence, when we use meetup list in our page component, we need to make sure that we do provide that meetups prop to it. It's also worth noting that meetup list, like meetup item and so on, is a regular React component. It is, however, stored in a components folder, not in the pages folder. Now, that folder name is up to you. The only reserved name in the end is the pages folder name. You can name your other folders however you want. I named it components though, because I do store React components in there, but the important difference to the page components is that those components stored in there will not be loaded as pages automatically. Instead, we can simply use them in the JSX code of other components, including page components. So we can include the Meetup list component on our main page here on the home page, simply by going to that homepage component and importing Meetup list there from going up one level, components, meetups, Meetup list. So I import this component from this file, and then we can use it here. And hence here we can, for example, output Meetup list like this, and then set this Meetups prop, which this component expects. And for the moment, we can then construct some dummy meetups here. Later, we'll be able to create and store our own meetups in a database. For the moment, let's use some dummy meetups. And that actually should be an array of meetup items where every item has an ID. For example, M1 for the first meetup, where every meetup then has a title, like a first meetup, where every meetup then has an image. And for this here, I'm using an image from Wikipedia, which is not taken by me, but which instead was taken by Thomas Wolf, to whom I therefore want to give due credits. So this image is taken by him. And I'll just grab that image here, grab the URL to that image, because we're not going to implement file upload here, and use that here as an image URL. Now every meetup should then also have an address, because that's another piece of data which we extract in the Meetup list component here. So we want to have that address field here as well. And I'll set this to some address 5123445 some city. And we can also add a description, even though we don't need that yet, but I will add it here, a description with this is a first meetup. And now we can of course replicate this. So duplicate this meetup and give the second one an ID of M2, and then name it a second meetup, and this is a second meetup, and maybe change the address and use a different image as well if you want to. I'll stick to the same one. And then we can pass this dummy meetups array into this meetups prop of the meetup list component. And that's all standard React. There's nothing Next.js specific about that. The only Next.js specific part here is that we're in a special component, which is special because it's in such a page file. Other than that, it's a regular React component. And if we now save that, if we save this and restart our development server here, because it crashed, because I had no page content initially, if we visit localhost 3000, we should see this on the screen. This is not the finished look, but this shows that it works and that our first page is loaded successfully. And we're using another React component in that page, a component which is not a page component. That is also worth pointing out. And with that, we got this page in place. Let's now also work on that new meetup page, and let's make sure we render some content here as well. So for this new meetup component, we again create a function here, a component function, like the new meetup page function. And of course, as before, we need to export this so that Next.js is able to find this, and then we can render our content here. Now, our content in this case should be the new meetup form component, which I prepared in advance, which renders a form with some controls, with some styles attached, using CSS modules here for styling. I'll come back to that in a second. That is supported by Next.js out of the box, which is really convenient. And then here we get that data, we extract that data the user entered with help of refs, which is a built-in React feature, has nothing to do with Next.js. And then we basically call a function which we expect to get on the onAddMeetup prop. And to that function, we then pass the collected meetup data. So this object with all the collected data. And hence now in this new meetup index.js file here, we can use that component. And we can import new meetup form from going up 2 levels to leave the Pages folder, diving into the Components folder, Meetups, and then New Meetup Form. And then we can return New Meetup Form, this component like this, if we want to. Now, as I just mentioned, in this component, we do expect that there will be a onAddMeetupProp, which holds a function that we can call, and hence we might want to prepare this function here as well. We can add our addMeetupHandler function, or however you want to name it, and then pass a pointer at this function to the onAddMeetupProp. A pointer and not the result of executing it. So no parentheses here, because this function should be executed eventually from inside that component when the form is submitted, as it turns out. Here we then get our entered meetup data, and we can, for example, for the moment, simply log this to the console. And with that out of the way, if we go back again, we can visit localhost 3000/new meetup, and we see this form. Again, not the final styling, a bit too wide, but we see the form. And if I open the developer tools here, and I enter test and test, or here we actually need a URL, so I will just quickly grab that URL which I set up for my dummy data. This URL, I'll grab that and use this here. Test address, and this is a test. If we enter this data and we click Add Meetup, we see this object logged to the console. So handling form submission works. Obviously, we're not doing anything with that data at this point. We're not navigating away, and we are going to do all these things later. But this again just shows us how we can use pages and also mix regular React components into those pages. And with that, that's a great start. But now we're already facing a couple of issues here. We got a lot of missing functionality, of course, and for example, we also have no way for navigating between pages. And we have no general layout around our pages. Every page takes up the entire width, we got no header above them, and that is probably something we want to change. Now, I did prepare some components here in the layout folder, in the components folder, that give our pages a general layout and also a main navigation bar which holds some links, some list items with links. We just need to use that. Now, this layout component is built such that we can wrap it around other components so that we can wrap it around other content that should be framed by that layout. Because layout, this component, uses props children to take what's between the opening and closing layout tags and wrap this component around that content. That means that we can, for example, go to the starting page, so index.js in the pages folder, and we can wrap meetup list with layout. Now for this, we also need to import layout, of course. So we import layout from going up, components, layout. We can add this import. And once this import was added, we can wrap layout around meetup list like this. And if we do that and save this, we get an error that link is not defined. Now we get this error because in that main navigation component, I'm using the link component, but I'm not importing it. Deliberately, because I wanted to do this together with you again, we learned about this link component and we import it from next/link, and that allows us to create those links. However, the toProp then should be changed to ref, because the link component offered by Next.js wants this ref prop where we define the destination of that link. But with that changed and with that link import added, if we now save everything and reload, we got this nice navigation bar at the top here. And we got a white border around that. For that, go into your global styles, and here in body, set margin to 0. That's something I forgot for the starting project. But if we add margin 0 to body in the globals CSS file, then this white border is gone, and now we got this frame here. And now we can also click all meetups to go to this starting page, and click add new meetup to go to this page. On this page, we are, of course, still missing the layout, though. We only have it on the starting page. Now, we want to have it on this new Meetup page as well, and therefore, of course, we can also wrap layout around our content on the new Meetup page to add the layout here as well. But you will probably see that this becomes cumbersome the more pages our application has. If we have an application with dozens or maybe hundreds of pages, wrapping our general layout around all the page contents, so going into all the page components to then wrap layout around the content, that becomes cumbersome. And that's now where this _app.js file becomes important. This is a special file, which exists in this pages folder out of the box, and which you could create on your own as well if it doesn't exist, and which should contain content like this. This is kind of your root component. This MyApp component, which is defined in there, and that is just a regular React component in the end, this special component acts as the root component Next.js will render. It receives props and uses object destructuring here to pull information out of the props. And the information it pulls out there is a component prop and a page props prop. These props are passed into this MyApp component automatically by Next.js, since Next.js is the thing using that specific component. And component is a prop that holds the actual page content that should be rendered, so it will be different whenever we switch a page. And page props are specific props our pages might be getting. And at the moment, our pages are not getting any props at all, because at the moment, we have no source that would provide such props. But that is something we're going to change. But with that, we now know that component here in this _app.js file will in the end be the actual page content of our different pages. And it will change whenever we navigate from page A to page B. Now, since that's the case, we can utilize this _app.js file and simply wrap this component here with our layout or with whichever wrapper you have, and we then don't have to do it inside of our different page files. So we can remove the layout wrapper from index.js here, from our home page. We can remove that and go back to just returning the meetup list and remove the layout import here, and instead go to _app.js, and then here we import layout from going up one level, diving into components, layout, and then pointing at the layout file. And we now wrap this component here with the layout component. And that means that our different page contents will be wrapped with this layout component. And hence, if we now save all files with all those changes, now on the new Meetup page, we also got this layout applied. We got the navigation bar, we got the extra styling, which ensures that the page content does not take the entire width. And hence, now on all the pages, we got this layout. And we don't need to wrap it around the different page contents inside of the different page files. And of course, that therefore is the way more maintainable and convenient approach of applying general components to our application. So whenever you have some component or some setting that affects all your pages, you can utilize this _app.js file to easily add that without diving into dozens of files individually. Now we got that layout in place. Before we work on the actual data fetching and sending data to a backend, let's work on that detail page. We got that show details button here, but it's not doing anything right now. Now the goal, of course, is to load this Meetup ID page, this dynamic page, whenever we click on a single Meetup item, to be precise, when we click on that show details button. And therefore, we first of all need a link. Now for this here on Meetup item, on this Meetup item component, we want to create a link here. And of course, we could do this with the link component. And this would be the correct way of doing that, since this would render an anchor tag. But to show you how you could navigate programmatically, something we will also need later again when we submit a form and navigate away, to show you this alternative, I will stick to a button here even though I will say that a link would technically be a bit better, but we'll stick to this button. And instead, I want to create a function here, a function which will then navigate us away. The show details handler, that could be the function name. And now we connect this button with the onClick prop to this function. And in the function, we now want to navigate programmatically. And we can navigate programmatically by using this useRouter hook, which we saw earlier already. So we can import useRouter, again, useRouter from next/router. And we can then call useRouter here in the component, not in the show details handler. It's a React hook, and therefore the rules of hooks apply, and we should only use React hooks directly at the root level of a component function. And hence here we call useRouter, get access to that router object, and it's then this router object which we can use in the show details handler to navigate programmatically. Because this router object does not just have the query property, which gives us access to all that data that might be part of the URL for a dynamic page, for example. But here we also have methods for navigating programmatically. For example, the push method. This pushes a new page onto the stack of pages, and it's the equivalent of using the link component if you don't want a link but instead navigate programmatically. Push therefore also takes a path to which we want to navigate. And here that should be our Meetup ID, because we have this Meetup ID page here. Now the Meetup ID is something we get via props, because when we render that Meetup list, we pass the ID prop into the Meetup item. And therefore inside of this Meetup item, we can now construct a dynamic path here by using props ID. So this will lead us to slash and then the specific ID of this Meetup item. Again here, programmatically. We could also render a link and construct the link path dynamically as an alternative. But with that, if we now save this and we reload, if I click show details, we get an error because we have no content for this page, but actually we see the URL was changed correctly. And the only missing thing indeed now is the content on this Meetup detail page. And that's therefore what we're going to add next. So for this Meetup detail page, I'll add a new functional component inside of that Meetup ID page, the Meetup details component. And I'll then export this as a default. Whoops, like this. Not Meetup list. Like this, and then here we return the content for the Meetup details page. Now here it's of course up to you how you want to display the details for a given item. I will output a fragment, which we need to import from React, so that we can have multiple adjacent JSX elements. And I'll then start by outputting the image of that Meetup item with some source and some alt text. Now, of course, later we will actually get the concrete data for a specific Meetup item here. At the moment, we don't really have any Meetup data source. We have this dummy array in the root index.js file, but it's only available in there. And whilst we could export this constant and then also use it in the Meetup detail page, I will not do this here because we're soon going to connect a real backend anyways. And therefore, for the moment, I'll just hard code some data in here. And I'll grab that data from the dummy data though, so from this dummy Meetups array, and I'll copy the image link here and use that as a source. And the alt text could be first Meetup like this. Then below that, I will add a h1 tag where I say first Meetup. And then below that, a paragraph with the Meetup description. We can also add an address element here, which is a default HTML element where we have the address. Like that. That could be how we output the Meetup details for the moment with some dummy data. And if I add this here in the Meetup details component, if we reload this Meetup details page, this is what we see. And that's okay, but of course not the final style which I'd like to have. I'd like to center all the text actually, and I would also like to shrink the image a little bit. Now for that, I haven't prepared any styles, so we can just quickly add some styles together here. And for this, I'll actually add a brand new component in the components meetups folder, which I'll name Meetup Detail, like this. And you don't have to create this component. I just like to keep my page component files pretty lean and outsource as much JSX code as possible into standalone components, but that is not something you have to do. Nonetheless, I will do it here, and I'll copy that fragment from the Meetup Details page component here and add it to the Meetup Detail single component and create that Meetup Detail component here. And of course, also export Meetup Detail here and return that JSX code here then, like this. And actually accept props already and expect that I get this data through props now, so that the data will be fetched in the page component later and will then be passed into this component, which is then responsible for actually presenting the content. So here we then have props.image. Here for alt, we could use props.title. What we then also use here for the h1 tag, props.title. And here for the address, that would be props.address. And here we have the description, props.description. And on the Meetup Details page component, we can now output this Meetup Detail component we just worked on. And for this, of course, import this Meetup Detail component up there. And now we just need to pass that data, which we expect in that component, through props into that Meetup Detail component. So here we can then add the image prop and then use our dummy image link or our dummy image content here for the moment. Set the title prop. First Meetup could be the title. Set the address prop to some street, 5, some city. And last but not least, set the description prop to this is a first meetup. And then we can get rid of the fragment and that JSX content in the page component and just use the Meetup Detail component here. Now, why am I doing that? Again, just to keep the JSX code lean here, and now also for styling reasons. We could have also imported a CSS file in the page component. This would work. It is a regular component after all. But I like to keep my pages folder lean and only have the page.js files in there. Now, for the other components, on the other hand, it is quite common that we pair a JavaScript file with a CSS file. And again, we could have done that in the pages folder as well, but I want to keep that folder leaner. Here for the components folder, it is more common to include these CSS files, and hence here I'll now also add a meetup detail.module.css file. The .module.css is important, by the way. We already used it all the time here, silently, so to say, because I provided all these components to you, but this actually unlocks a feature called CSS modules. It's a feature which you might know from standard React. It allows you to scope CSS class styles to a React component, and it is supported out of the box in Next.js projects. If you name a CSS file like this, ending with .module.css, and you then import it into your JavaScript file in a certain way, which I'll show you in a second, then the CSS styles defined in the CSS file will be scoped to this component, at least if you use CSS classes as selectors. Now, that special way of importing can be seen in the other JavaScript files. It looks like this. We import classes, or however you want to name it, from the CSS file. And that's a special way of importing, which will be picked up by Next.js, and behind the scenes it will then transform the CSS classes so that the class names are unique per component. And that ensures that your styles can't spill over to other components. That's why I also wanted to show you this approach here. So now we can import classes from /meetupDetail meetup.module.css like this. And now classes is a JavaScript object in the end, where any CSS classes you define in your CSS file will be available as properties on this object. And if you access them, the values will be the transformed CSS files, which are guaranteed to be unique. And that allows you to use the same CSS class names in different components without clashing with the styles. And now we could replace fragment here with section and give that section a class name of classes.detail, let's say, like this. And if we do that, we can now add a detail CSS class here in the meetup detail.module CSS file. And the styles we define in there will then be applied to this section because it gets this transformed detail class under the hood. And that is a nice feature to have, which is why I also wanted to show it to you. Now with that, we can, for example, select the image, which is inside of that element with the detail class. So this image, we can select this and then change its look, change its style. For example, give it a width of 100%, which ensures that it stays in the box that is reserved for this page by the layout component. We can also select the overall detail class again, so the entire section with that class on it, and set text align to center, so that all the text elements are centered. And that could now be our detail page. Of course, you can tweak it, you can add more styles, you can make sure that it looks the way you want it to look. I don't want to turn this into a CSS course. I just wanted to show you this CSS modules feature and show you this approach which you don't have to use, but which I like to use, that I keep my page component files relatively lean, especially regarding the JSX code, and I instead use embeddable standard React components for the actual JSX code, and like in this case, for the styling. And with that, we have our detail page in place. And now we got all these pages here, which we need. Now with that, we can work towards replacing that dummy data source, our dummy array here in the root index.js file, with a real backend, with a real data source. Now at the moment, we are using this dummy meetups array for rendering our list of meetups. And on the meetup detail page, we just have some hard-coded dummy data. And that's not realistic. In reality, we would have a backend, some database which holds that data. Now let's simulate that we do. And later we'll actually have one. But first of all, let's simulate that we do have one. And in the homepage component, in this root index.js file, let's not pass dummy meetups into the meetups prop like this, but instead, let's change this component to behave the way it would behave if we would reach out to a backend. And how would we typically do this in React? Well, if we want to send a HTTP request once this page is rendered, we would typically use the useFact hook to control this. So we would import useFact from React and then execute useFact here and have an empty dependencies array probably, which means that this effect function runs whenever the component is first rendered, but never thereafter. And then in here, we could fetch our data. And we could manage some state for this component with the useState hook, which we therefore also need to import from React. And then here we could manage our list of meetups. Let's say the loaded meetups, and we have our set loaded meetups state updating function. And in useFact, we would send a HTTP request and fetch data. And then once that's done, it would be an asynchronous task, of course, but once that's done, we would call set loaded meetups like this and set the meetups that we fetched from a server as the meetups for this component. And for the moment, let's just simulate that we fetched the dummy meetups. Of course, they are available right from the start here, but let's assume we just fetched them from a server. So some promise completed here, and we got back the response. And now I set my dummy meetups as the loaded meetups. And here in the JSX code, we pass the loaded meetups, so our state, into meetup list. If we do all of that, if we visit the starting page with all the meetups, we don't see any difference there. When I reload, all the meetups are there right from the start, because we never really send a HTTP request. But technically there is a difference, because it is important to note that useEffect works such that it executes this function after the component function was executed. So that means that the first time this homepage component is rendered, loaded meetups will be an empty array. Then this effect function will execute, it will then update the state, and then this component function will execute again, because the state changed, and it will then re-render the list with the actual data. But we'll have two component render cycles, and in the first render cycle, the first time this component renders, the loaded meetup state will be this initial state, this empty array. Now, why am I emphasizing this? Because if we would fetch this from a backend, our users might see a loading spinner briefly, which could or could not be the user experience we want to offer. But in addition, even here, where we don't really send a request, and where the response, in quotes, arrives basically instantly, even in this case, because of these two render cycles, we have a problem with search engine optimization. If I view the page source, you will notice that in there, the actual meetup data is missing. I got my unordered list here, and this unordered list is empty. So the items which we see on the screen here, these items, are missing in the HTML content in the HTML page we fetched from the server. And they are missing because they are only rendered in the second component execution cycle. But the pre-rendered HTML page generated by Next.js automatically does not wait for this second cycle. It always takes the result of the first render cycle and returns that as the pre-rendered HTML code. And there, this data is missing. Now, of course, here with the dummy data, it is redundant to do it like this. But as I said, we are basically just simulating that we do fetch this data from a server. And then we'll face the problem that Next.js does not wait for that data to be fetched to then return the fully pre-rendered page, but it returns the result of the first component render cycle. And that might be a pretty empty page. And that now was a lengthy explanation of the problem we're facing here, but it is an important problem, and it is important to understand this problem properly. But thankfully, Next.js also has solutions to this problem. It has more core features built into Next.js that help us with precisely this problem, that we want to pre-render a page with data, but with data for which we have to wait. And we need to tell Next.js once we're done waiting. And therefore, that's now what we're going to explore next, how we can fetch data for pre-rendering. Next.js has this built-in page pre-rendering, but this built-in process has a flaw, if you want to call it like this. As I showed you a couple of seconds ago, the page that is pre-rendered has basically the snapshot after the first component render cycle as its content, and that might be missing crucial data. So if we visit some route, if some request is sent to some route to this page, then there we return that pre-rendered page, but we might be missing data here. So whilst this is theoretically good for SEO, for search engine optimization, it might not always be. But after this HTML page was received, React will actually take over. The page is hydrated, as this process is called, which means that now React will turn this into a single page application and take over control. And then this useEffect function might be executed, data might be fetched, and the page might be updated in the browser, not on the server, not on the pre-rendered page, but instead after this page was received in the browser. And therefore we then have a fully interactive page or app with all the data we need. But if we wanna pre-render a page with data, so that this initially returned HTML code already contains the data, we need to fine-tune this built-in pre-rendering process, and we need to configure it. And for this, Next.js gives us two forms of pre-rendering which we can use for controlling how the pages should be rendered. It has something which is called static generation, and it has an alternative which is called server-side rendering. And the two might sound similar, but they run, or the code runs at different points of time, as you will learn over the next minutes. Now we're going to start with static generation, because that is the approach which you typically should use. But how does it work? When using static generation, a page component is pre-rendered when you build your application, when you build the next project, so when you build it for production. And that's important. With static generation, by default, your page is not pre-rendered on the fly on the server when a request reaches the server, but instead it is pre-rendered when you as a developer build your site for production. And that means that after it was deployed, that pre-rendered page does not change, at least not by default. If you then updated the data and you know that the pre-rendered page needs to change, you need to start that build process again and redeploy again. But that might sound worse than it actually is, because for a lot of applications, pages don't change all the time, page content doesn't change all the time, and if it should change frequently, there are alternatives, which I will also show you in a couple of minutes. But for the moment, let's start with this static generation. Now, as I mentioned, by default, Next.js prepares your pages. It by default generates your pages already statically, and it by default does that during the build process. But if you need to wait for data, if you need to add data fetching to a page component, you can do so by exporting a special function from inside your page component file. And that's important. This now only works in your page component files, not in other component files, only in component files inside of the pages folder. In there, you can export a function called getStaticProps. And it has to be called getStaticProps. This is a reserved name, so to say. Next.js will look for a function with that name, and if it finds it, it executes this function during this pre-rendering process. So it will then not directly call your component function and use the returned JSX snapshot as HTML content, but it will first of all call getStaticProps before it calls the component function. And getStaticProps has this name because indeed its job is to prepare props for this page. And these props could then contain the data this page needs. And that's useful because getStaticProps is allowed to be asynchronous. You can return a promise there. And then, and that's the key thing, Next.js will wait for this promise to resolve, which means it waits until your data is loaded, and then you return the props for this component function. And with that, you're able to load data before this component function is executed so that this component can be rendered with the required data. Now here in getStaticProps, you can also execute any code that would normally only run on a server. You could access a file system here or securely connect to a database. Because any code you write in here will never end up on the client side and it will never execute on the client side. Simply because this code is executed during the build process, not on the server and especially not on the clients of your visitors. So the code in here will never reach the machines of your visitors. It will never execute on their machines. Now here in getStaticProps, you can do whatever you want. For example, fetch data from an API or from a database, or read data from some files in the file system, like we do it in my full Next.js course, for example. But then once you're done with whatever you did to get the data you need, you need to return an object here in getStaticProps. You always need to return an object here. Now in this object, you can configure various things, but most importantly, you typically set a props property here, and it has to be named props. And that then holds another object, which will be the props object you receive in your component function here, in this page component function. This now receives a props object, and the object will be the object you set as props here in getStaticProps. And there we could have our Meetups key in there. The structure of this props object is totally up to you, which holds our dummy meetups. With that, those dummy meetups would be loaded and prepared in getStaticProps, and then they would be set as props for this page component. Therefore, in this page component, we no longer need to manage state, we no longer need use effect, and we can therefore get rid of those imports here, because now we get the data through props. And our meetups for the meetup list component are props.meetups. .meetups because I'm adding a meetups prop down there. And that's how we can move the data fetching away from the client to the server side, or to be precise, to the during the build process side. If I now save everything, if we reload our page, we still see our meetups here. But if I now view the page source, we see that we no longer have an empty unordered list. Instead, we have an unordered list which has list items with the images and the title and so on. So now this is pre-rendered, and it now contains the full HTML code, and that's of course also great for search engines then, because now data is not fetched in a second component render cycle on the client, but initially before this page is pre-rendered during the build process. And that's a great plus and one of the main features of Next.js, this data fetching for pre-rendering. And getStaticProps will be a function you use a lot when working with Next.js, as you also see in my full course. Now, to fully understand getStaticProps and also see what we can do with it, let's quit the dev server for now and run npm run build. This is the build command which you need to run before you deploy your Next.js site. Now, we are not going to deploy here, but running it is still helpful and interesting. If we run npm run build here to build that production build, to create that production build, we see some output here. And in this output, we see what it did, and that it generated some static pages, for example, 4 pages to be precise, and we see which pages it generated. And what we see here is that it generated the root page for /nothing, the dynamic page for /meetup ID, a 404 page, which it actually generates for us automatically by default in case we enter an invalid URL, and the new meetup page. And then we got these icons here next to the pages, a filled dot and 3 empty dots. If we scroll down, we see a legend here, and we learn that a filled dot is a statically generated site. That's what SSG stands for, static site generation, which was automatically generated as HTML, and JSON, which is then used for prefetching data once the page turned into a single page application. The empty dot stands for static generation. That's almost the same. The only difference is that here we got no initial props, so we have no initial data that was fetched. And indeed, only for the root page we are fetching data, because that is the page where we added getStaticProps, and that's why we have the filled dot here. Now, we will work on some other pages later. To be precise, we will work on the Meetup ID page soon, but for example, the new Meetup page does not need any data fetching. There, we in the end only render our form, and we don't need any data here. We don't fetch any data from a server. And therefore, the new Meetup page will always stay a static page with no content. So that is fine. But we will turn the Meetup ID page into a SSG page later. But for the moment, we see that only the starting page, the root page, is such a statically generated site. Now with that, let's start the development server again. And let's think about potential problems we could be facing when using getStaticProps. And one pretty big problem, which we could face in some websites, depending on what we're doing, is that the data here could be outdated. This page, as I mentioned, is generated during the build process. So thereafter, we deploy it. If we then add more meetups to our database, this pre-generated page would not know about them. And if we don't add any client-side data fetching, we would always just see the outdated meetups here. And this could, of course, be a problem. Now, we can always rebuild our site and redeploy when our data changes. And for some websites, like personal blogs, this is a great alternative, because their data doesn't change too frequently. But if data does change more frequently, there is an extra property which we can add to this returned object. And that's the revalidate property. When we add this property to the object returned by getStaticProps, we unlock a feature called incremental static generation. Revalidate wants a number, let's say 10, and this number is the number of seconds Next.js will wait until it regenerates this page for an incoming request. That means that with revalidate set to some number, this page will not just be generated during the build process. It will be generated there, but not just. But it will also be generated every couple of seconds on the server, at least if there are requests for this page. So that means that this page, with revalidate set to 10, would be regenerated on the server at least every 10 seconds if there are requests coming in for this page. And then these regenerated pages would replace the old pre-generated pages. And with that, you would ensure that your data is never older than 10 seconds. And therefore, the number of seconds you want to use here depends on your data update frequency. If your data changes once every hour, then setting this to 3600 might be great. If it changes all the time, 1 second might be better. But whatever you set this number to, you will ensure that this page will occasionally be pre-generated on the server after deployment, so that you don't have to redeploy and rebuild all the time just because some data changed. It doesn't really matter to us here, especially not as long as we're just using this dummy array, but it is an important feature you should know about, and that is how you can set it. So getStaticProps is a very useful function which you can export in your page components to ensure that your pre-rendered pages contain data you might need to wait for. Now with revalidate, you can ensure that this page is also updated regularly after deployment. But sometimes even a regular update is not enough. Sometimes you really want to regenerate this page for every incoming request. So you want to pre-generate the page dynamically on the fly after deployment on the server. Not during the build process and not every couple of seconds, but for every request. And if that's your goal, then there is an alternative to getStaticProps. Now I will comment out getStaticProps because it is the better choice here and I want to use it later again, but I want to show you this alternative as well. And that would be another function which you can export, a function that can also be async if you want to, and that's the getServerSideProps function. Just like getStaticProps, that is a reserved name, which Next.js will be looking for, and the difference to getStaticProps is that this function will now not run during the build process, but instead always on the server after deployment. Now you will still return an object here, an object with a props property. Because after all, this function still is about getting the props for this page component. And you can still then fetch data from an API here or from the file system, whatever you want to do. Any code you write in here will always run on the server, never in the client. So you can run server-side code in here. You can also perform operations that use credentials that should not be exposed to your users, because this code only runs on the server. And then ultimately, you return your props object. So here an object with a Meetups key, which holds my dummy Meetups, for example. Now you can't set revalidate here because it doesn't make any sense here. This getServerSideProps function runs for every incoming request anyways, so there is no need to revalidate every X seconds. Now what you can do in here is you can work with a parameter which you'll receive, the context parameter. You actually also get this in getStaticProps, but I will come back to it there later. You do get it here in getServerSideProps as well, and there, in this context argument, in this context parameter, you also get access to the request object under the rec key and the response object that will be sent back. And if you worked with Node.js and Express before, this might look kind of familiar to you. There you also get request and response objects in your middleware to then work with those. And especially having access to the concrete request object can be helpful, for example, when you're working with authentication and you need to check some session cookie or anything like this. This is something which I show in my full Next.js course. It's a little too advanced here. But you do have access to the incoming request and all its headers and the request body if you need to. And that then might give you extra data or information which you need for the code that executes in getServerSideProps. Ultimately, you then don't return a response by working on that response object here, but instead you return this object with the props key, which holds the props for this page component function. So that is how you then can use getServerSideProps for preparing that data for your page. And if we do use getServerSideProps here, if we save everything, if I reload the starting page, you see it works just as before. And if we view the page source, we also see all the data in there again, the unordered list with all the list items. That works exactly as we learned it, but now the page is really pre-generated for every incoming request. Now, which one of the two should you use? Is getServerSideProps better or getStaticProps? getServerSideProps might sound better because it's guaranteed to run for every request. But that actually can be a disadvantage, because that means that you need to wait for your page to be generated on every incoming request. Now, if you don't have data that changes all the time, and with that I really mean that it changes multiple times every second, and if you don't need access to the request object, let's say for authentication, getStaticProps is actually better. Because there you pre-generate a HTML file. That file can then be stored and served by a CDN. And that simply is faster than pre-generating and fetching that data for every incoming request. So your page will be faster when working with getStaticProps, because then it can be cached and reused instead of regenerated all the time. Hence, you should really only use getServerSideProps if you need access to that concrete request object, because you don't have access to request and response in getStaticProps, or if you really have data that changes multiple times every second and therefore even revalidate won't help you. Then getServerSideProps is a great choice. Now here for our Meetup list though, it's not a great choice, because that is not data which changes frequently, and here I also don't need to work with the incoming request. And therefore I will comment getServerSideProps out again and comment getStaticProps in, because with that we can take advantage of the caching and we're not pre-generating the page multiple times unnecessarily. Now that was a lot of talking about getStaticProps and getServerSideProps. But these are two key concepts, two key functions built into Next.js, which you need all the time. As you see in my full course, for example, when we work on that full blog project, we use those functions everywhere. They are super important. And hence, let's also use them for the Meetup detail page now. For the new Meetup page, as explained earlier, we don't need them because here we don't need any data. And therefore there is no need to add getStaticProps. It's really only there to fetch data for the pre-generated page, if that page needs any data. And therefore we don't need it here. But on the Meetup detail page, of course, we do have data that is needed. For the moment, hard-coded data, but that will change. And hence here on Meetup details, we also want to use getStaticProps or getServerSideProps. Now, which one is better? It depends on how often your data changes and if you need access to the request object. And here it's probably fair to assume that the Meetup data does not change very often. Indeed, this app doesn't even have a feature for changing the Meetup data. We can only add meetups. But even if it would have a change feature, it would probably not be the case that a Meetup changes multiple times every second. And therefore, for the Meetup details, I would argue that, again, getStaticProps is better than getServerSideProps. So here we export getStaticProps, and we can turn it into an async function if we want to use async await. And then here we could fetch the data for a single Meetup. And then we can, of course, return this object with the props. And here we could have our Meetup data prop, or however you want to name it, which could again be a nested object, where we then have this data here. So where we have that image, so we have image set to the string, where we have the ID if we need it, M1, where we have the title, first Meetup here, where we have the address, and that's this address, and where we then also have the description here, this description. That could be the props data which we send to this component function. But here we'll actually have a slight problem. Keep in mind that this is a dynamic page. So when we reach out to an API to fetch the data for a single meetup, we need a way of identifying that meetup. We need its ID, for example. Now, the ID, thankfully, is encoded in the URL. And therefore, we did learn that we can use that useRouter hook to get access to this router object and then use the query property there. That's what we did earlier in this course. But the problem with that is that the useRouter hook can only be used in the component function, not in getStaticProps. That's not a function where you can use React hooks. So we can't get the Meetup ID from the URL with help of useRouter in here. But we also don't need to, because you might remember this context parameter which I mentioned. I showed it to you on getServerSideProps, but I mentioned that it also actually exists on getStaticProps. Now, when we accept it on getStaticProps, context will not hold request and response, but it will, for example, have a params key. So there will be context.params. And that will be an object where our identifiers between the square brackets will be properties, and the values will be the actual values encoded in the URL. So our Meetup ID, for example, could be accessed with context.params.meetupid. Meetup ID because that's the identifier I have between the square brackets. And that would then be the concrete Meetup ID for which we're displaying this meetup. I can console log this here inside of getStaticProps so that we can see that this really works. And then it's this Meetup ID which we could set as an ID here if we want to expose it to the component function. With that, if we save this, and visit the detail page of a single meetup, we get an error though. getStaticPaths is required. Now, what's this error about? getStaticPaths is another function Next.js understands, just like getStaticProps and getServerSideProps. And getStaticPaths is a function you need to export in a page component file if it's a dynamic page, like we have it here, and you're using getStaticProps. Not if you're using getServerSideProps, and not if you're using neither getStatic nor getServerSideProps, but it is needed if you do use getStaticProps. So in that case, you need to export another function here in this page component file, and that's the getStaticPaths function. And this can also be an async function so that you can use async await in there. Now, what's the deal with getStaticPaths though? To understand it, let's again think about the fact that with getStaticProps, a page is pre-generated during the build process. Now, what does this mean? This means that, of course, Next.js needs to pre-generate all versions of this dynamic page in advance for all the supported IDs. Because since this is dynamic, Next.js needs to know for which ID values it should pre-generate the page. Because how would it pre-generate this page otherwise? We get the ID from the URL here, great, but keep in mind that this is not pre-generated when a user visits this page with a specific value in the URL, but during the build process. So here we need to pre-generate it for all the URLs, for all the Meetup ID values users might be entering at runtime. And if they enter an ID for which we didn't pre-generate a page, they will see a 404 error. But because that is how it works, we need to add getStaticPaths, which has the job of returning an object where we describe all the dynamic segment values. So all the Meetup IDs in this case, for which this page should be pre-generated. Now for this object needs to have a paths key, which is an array. And in that array, you must have multiple objects, one object per version of this dynamic page, where this object has a params key, that's a must-have, which then itself again is an object with all the key value pairs that might lead to your dynamic page. So if you have multiple dynamic segments, then you would have multiple keys in this nested object. Here we only have Meetup ID as a single dynamic segment, and hence here in this params object, we would add a Meetup ID key and then enter the concrete value for Meetup ID for which this page should be pre-generated. And if we have multiple possible values, like in this case where I have M1 and M2, we would return a paths array with 2 objects inside of it, where the other one uses M2 as a Meetup ID. Now in reality, you would of course not hard code this as a developer, but you would also fetch your supported IDs from a database or from an API and generate this array dynamically. And we are also going to do that later, but for the moment, let's hard code it. With that, if you save that file with getStaticPaths added with this code, and with getStaticProps still being in there, with that, if you now reload, we don't get this error anymore. Instead, we get this error regarding the fallback key instead of getStaticPaths. And that's another piece of configuration which you need to add in this returned object next to your paths key, the fallback key. This key tells Next.js whether your paths array contains all supported parameter values or just some of them. If you set fallback to false, you say that your paths contains all supported Meetup ID values. That means that if the user enters anything that's not supported here, for example M3, he or she would see a 404 error. If you set fallback to true, on the other hand, Next.js would try to generate a page for this Meetup ID dynamically on the server for the incoming request. Fallback is a nice feature because it allows you to pre-generate some of your pages for specific Meetup ID values, for example, the pages which are visited most frequently, and then pre-generate the missing ones dynamically when requests for them are coming in. Here, however, I'll set fallback to false to indicate that I defined all supported paths here. Now, if you want to learn more about fallback and so on, I do cover that in greater detail in my full course, but the general concept is that we can simply define some paths instead of all paths if we, for example, have hundreds of pages and we don't want to pre-generate all of them, but maybe just our most popular pages. And therefore, with fallback added now, if we save this again and reload, now we successfully load the page for this first meetup. If I go to M2, that also works. But if I enter M3, I get the default 404 page here because I had fallback set to false and M3 is not one of the supported parameters here. That's how this works. And getStaticPaths therefore is another important function which you need in dynamic pages to tell Next.js for which dynamic parameter values this page should be pre-generated. And then again, getStaticProps executes for every page, so for every Meetup ID value, allows you to fetch data for that meetup, and allows you to return props for that meetup. And as a side note here, where I log the Meetup ID, we do see that here in this terminal. We don't see it in the browser developer tools. Here the console is empty because I mentioned that this is code, the code inside of getStaticProps, which runs during build time. And when running in the development server, it does run for every incoming request, but only on the developer server side. So we only see it in the terminal of this developer server then, and not in the browser. That's how getStaticProps works for dynamic pages, and that's how getStaticPaths works and why it is required. So now we covered getStaticProps and getStaticPaths and getServerSideProps, and I hope it's clear what these functions do and why they exist. They allow us to fetch data for pre-rendering those pages, so that we pre-render the pages with the data instead of without the data they might need. Now up to this point, we're only working with dummy data though, which is not actually fetched from anywhere. Instead, we have this dummy array, or in the case of the Meetup ID page here, actually hard-coded data in that return statement. And that's of course not realistic at all. Instead, we do have this add new meetup page here, which would allow us to enter data for a new meetup. And hence, we're now going to finish this app by adding a real backend with a real database where the data will be stored and from which we then fetch it. And this then also allows me to show you the last major Next.js feature which is added by Next to your React apps. Next.js makes it easy for us to build an API, a backend API, together with our front-end React app in the same project. For this, we can use another key Next.js feature called API routes. API routes are special routes, special pages, if you want to call it like this, which don't return HTML code, but which are instead about accepting incoming HTTP requests, also post, patch, put, delete requests, whatever you need, with JSON data attached to them, and which then might do whatever you need to do, for example, store data in a database, and then return JSON data. So you could say API routes allow you to build your own API endpoints as part of this Next project. And they will then be served by the same server as your Next app. Now to add API routes, you add a special folder in your Pages folder. And that's a folder named API. And just as the Pages folder has to be named Pages, this folder has to be named API. And it has to be in the Pages folder. Then Next.js will pick up any JavaScript files stored in there and turn those files into API routes, so into endpoints that can be targeted by requests and that should receive JSON and return JSON. Now in this API folder, you can then again add JavaScript files where the file names will act as path segments in the URL. For example, a new Meetup.js file again. Now here in the API folder. Now in those JavaScript files here, you then don't create a React component function. These API routes are not about defining, rendering, or returning React components. Instead, in there, we will define functions which contain server-side code, because API routes will only run on the server, never on the client. The code in them will never be exposed to the client, so we can also use credentials in API routes without compromising them. And those functions are then simply triggered whenever a request is sent to this route, so to /API/new meetup here. This would be the URL of this file, and if a request is sent to this URL, it will trigger the function which we have to define in this file. Now often this function is named handler, but the name is up to you. The important thing is that it's exported. So we export this handler function here. And this function will receive a request and a response object. You might know this from Node.js and Express.js. The request object contains data about the incoming request. The response object will be needed for sending back a response. Now from that request object, we can get things like the headers or the request body, and also the request method through the method property here. This allows us to find out which kind of request was sent, and we could, for example, check if we are receiving a post request here. So if the request method is post, and we only execute the code in this if check if it is an incoming post request. For other kinds of requests, we don't do anything. So that would ensure that only post requests to this route would actually trigger this code in here. Then here we can get our data by accessing rec.body. The body field is another built-in field which contains the body of the incoming request, the data of the incoming request. And then we can do whatever we need to do. Now this here will be the endpoint for creating a new meetup. And therefore it's probably fair to expect that this data which we get contains a title, a meetup image, an address, and a description field. After all, it's our page, our project, and our API, so we can expect whichever data we need. We will then just have to make sure that we send the correct data when we do send a request to this API route later. But for the moment, I do indeed expect that we get some data out of this data, so out of this request body, and I'll use object destructuring here, and I expect to get a title, an image field, an address field, and a description field. So these are the 4 fields which I expect to get on the incoming request body. And then we can store them in a database, for example. And that's what we're going to do now. Now, as a database, I will use MongoDB here, and to be precise, I'll use their cloud offering, MongoDB Atlas, which is a fully managed, cloud-based MongoDB database with which we can get started for free. All you need to do is click Try Free. This will then get you to MongoDB Atlas in the end, and create an account for free here. So just enter some data about yourself and then get started for free. If you do all of that, after logging in, you'll end up on a page where you can create a new cluster. You might also automatically end up in that Create a Cluster wizard. And here you can generally leave all the settings as they are. Just make sure that you always pick the free tier settings unless you want to pay. So for example, you can go with AWS and the default region here. And leave all the other default settings as well. Especially make sure that you're using the M0 sandbox here. I can't select this here because I already do have a cluster created based on that sandbox. But if you don't have a cluster yet, you should be able to select M0 sandbox. And that is the cluster tier you should use then. And then just leave all the other default settings and create your cluster. Again, I already have one based on that M0 sandbox here, and therefore you eventually should also have one. Now that's the cluster, the MongoDB database cluster, which we'll use to connect to then create our database in there and to store our data in there. Now, in order to be able to connect to this cluster, there are two things you also have to do here in this MongoDB Atlas console. Under network access, you have to add your local IP here by clicking on Add IP Address and then selecting Current IP, so that your local computer is able to send requests to MongoDB. And under database access, you need to create at least one user with any username of your choice who has to have read and write access to the database, like this user here does, so that this is a user with which we can connect to this cluster later. And once you did all of that, on clusters, you can click on Connect and then connect your application to learn how you can connect to this cluster. And here we now actually need to use the Node.js MongoDB driver to write code here in our API route that does send queries to this MongoDB Atlas cluster. For this, we need to quit the development server and install an extra package with npm install, the MongoDB package. This is the official MongoDB driver, which makes sending queries to MongoDB easy. Once you installed it, you can start the development server again. And now this MongoDB driver allows us to connect to this cluster and then insert data or fetch data from there. For this, in this API route file, we can import something from MongoDB, and that something is the Mongo client object. This is an object which allows us to connect. We can execute this code here. We can use Mongo client and call the connect method here. Now the connect method wants this connection string, which we have here. So you should copy that string and then pass this as a parameter here to the connect method. Now there you need to plug in the username and password of your user. So that user who has read and write access which you created. And I'll quickly do this without the angle brackets, like this. Now I will have changed my password when you're viewing this, so you don't need to try to connect to my cluster. You also should replace my first database with any database name of your choice, for example, Meetups, but that is up to you. Now when you do that, connect will establish a connection. And this is code which you never want to run on the client side, because you would expose your credentials to your visitors, which is a security problem. But here in this API route, it's no problem because, as I mentioned before, the code defined in here will never end up on the client side. So this is a secure place to store credentials. Now connect does return a promise, and hence we can turn our handler function into an async function to use await. This is possible and supported by Next.js. And then this will give us a connected client eventually. Now on that client object, we can call the DB method to get hold of that database to which we're connecting here. By the way, if that database doesn't exist yet, it will be created on the fly. And then on this database, we can get access to our Meetups collection. Now, MongoDB is a NoSQL database that works with collections full of documents. Collections would be kind of your tables in a SQL database, and documents would be your entries in those tables. So you have collections which hold multiple documents. And a single meetup would be a single document. The overall collection then holds multiple meetups, multiple meetup documents. And you get hold of a collection by using your database and then the collection method. And the collection can have any name of your choice. Just as the database, if it doesn't exist yet, it will be generated on the fly. And it could be named meetups as well. So it can have the same name as the database, but you can also use different names here. And now that we got hold of the meetups collection, on that collection here we can call insert1, which is one of the built-in query commands for inserting one new document into this collection. And now the great thing about MongoDB is that a document is just an object in the end, a JavaScript object. And that now could be an object with title, image, address, and description. And since that's the case, since that would make a lot of sense, we can also just directly insert data, so this full data object, into our database. And hence, of course, we don't even need to use destructuring here. Now we would insert this data object into the database. Now this also is an async operation. Insert1 returns a promise, and hence we can await this here as well to get back the result of this operation. Result will be an object with, for example, the automatically generated ID. We can console log result here if we want to. Now we can also add error handling here to handle the case that connecting failed or inserting failed. And I do this in the full course, but here let's keep this focused and concise and let's simply assume that it will work. You can simply use try catch to wrap this to add error handling if you want to. Now I want to call client close then to close the database connection once we're done. And then we need to use this response object to send back a response. Because we're getting a request, we're then storing data in the database. Ultimately, we also need to send back a response then. And we do this with this response object. Now this works similar to what you might be used to from Node Express. You have a status method, which you can call on response, to set a HTTP status code of the response which will be returned. For example, a 201 status code to indicate that something was inserted successfully. You can then chain a JSON call here to prepare the JSON data that will be added to the outgoing response. And here we could, for example, add a message key where we say meetup inserted. But of course, it's totally up to you which kind of response you want to return. With that, however, we have a basic API route which will insert meetups into our database. And therefore, in the next step, we can now send a request to this API route from the front end when this form here is submitted, so that we actually do trigger this API route and we use that code here. Now, sending a request to the API route works just as sending a request to any API, to any backend, works in React. In our new Meetup form component, we call onAddMeetup on props to pass our collected data there. And in the end, therefore, we need to go to the component that uses new Meetup form to work with that data. And that is our new Meetup page. There we have this add Meetup handler, which gets this collected data. And therefore, it's here where we now want to send a request to our API route. And we can send a request just as we know it. For example, with the built-in fetch function or with a third-party package like Axios. Now here I'll use the fetch function, and I want to use async await, so I will turn this into an async function and await the response here. And then we need to insert the URL to which we want to send a request. Now often that is some domain.com and then some path if it's an external API. But here it's of course an internal API, which will be hosted by the same server as is being used for serving this page. And therefore, we just can construct an absolute path here to send a request to the same server but a different path on that server. And the path is /API, because it's this special API folder, and then the file name, so /meetup, a new meetup, without the file extension. And if you named this JavaScript file differently here, you need to use a different name here as well. This will now send a request to this new Meetup.js file in the API folder, and it will then trigger this function. Next.js will trigger this function for us when a request reaches this path. Now we actually do need to send a post request because we're not doing anything for different kinds of requests. And hence here we need to use this second argument, which we can pass to fetch to configure this request. And for example, we can set the method key to post here. We then should also add the body, the data attached to this request. And that has to be a JavaScript object which carries the data which we want to store in our database. A title, an image, an address, and a description field. Now here, entered meetup data, which we're getting from new meetup form, does have those fields already. It has a title, image, address, and description field. And since that's the case, in the end we can simply pass entered meetup data as a body. However, not like this, but instead we need to convert it to JSON, which we can do with the built-in JSON stringify method. Then we can also add some headers to make it clear that we're sending JSON data by adding the content type header and setting this to application JSON. And with that, our request is configured and will be sent. Eventually, we then get a response, and we can then also get data from that response if we want to, just like this, as we always do it for responses we get from the fetch function. And then we can work with that data. But here I'm not interested in it, so we'll just log that data. If we do all of that, if we save all the files, and if we ensured that MongoDB whitelisted our local IP and that the credentials for connecting to the database are correct, if we did all of that, we should be able to go back to our form here and reload, open the DevTools, and then enter our data here, like a first meetup. And then I will again grab this URL, which I picked before, and insert this here as an image. And then some address, some street 5, some city, and this is a first meetup as a description. And if I now click add meetup, we see this response eventually, which is looking good, because meetup inserted is the message we're sending back from the API route. And if we go to MongoDB, to our cluster, and click on collections, there we should then actually also see a meetups database. And you might not see the other databases here, because I created more databases in this cluster, but you should see a meetups database with a meetups collection, and in there you should see one meetup with the data you just added, and an automatically generated ID. And that's our API route in action and how we can send a request to it. Now, of course, we now probably want to navigate away after we added a meetup, and therefore, back in the new meetup page here, so not the API route, but the front-end facing page, after we got our response here, we might want to navigate away programmatically, and we learned how that worked. We can use the use router hook and import it from next router, therefore, to get access to that router object. And once we got that, here after logging maybe, we can navigate away with the push method, or here maybe also with the replace method to make sure we can't go back with the back button if you want to ensure that that's not possible. Here I don't want to do that, and hence I'll just push this and then go back to just /nothing, so to the starting page, let's say. And with that, if we save this and I then enter a second meetup here and the image link again, second street 2, this is the second street. If we do all of that, click add meetup, you see eventually we're navigated away. And of course, we could also show a loading spinner and do all of that, but that's then all just client-side standard React, nothing Next.js specific about it. The Next.js specific part was this API route. And as you see, that route is now working just fine. So it's great that we're now storing meetups here in our collection, but of course we're not using those stored meetups. If we go to all meetups, I still display my dummy meetups. The same for the details page. Here we would now want to fetch data from MongoDB as well. And of course we could now create new API routes. We could create an API route called meetups, and in there we add this handler function, we connect to MongoDB, and we then write code that fetches all the meetups. And then on the starting page, in getStaticProps here, we could simply use fetch, and indeed Next.js adds a feature that you can use fetch on server-side code as well. Normally, you can only use it in the browser, but in Next projects, you can use fetch in server-side code snippets as well. And we could then use fetch, therefore, to send a request to /API meetups, fetch all the meetups, and then populate our props with those meetups. We could do that, but it would be a bit cumbersome. Sending a request to our own API endpoint here is a bit redundant. Keep in mind that I mentioned that the code you add here in getStaticProps, just as in getServerSideProps and getStaticPaths, will only run on the server or during build time, but never in the client. So the code in here will also not be exposed to the client. So therefore here, if you want to fetch all meetups, we can directly write the code for doing so here inside of getStaticProps, or in a helper function, which we then execute here. So we don't need to send a request to our own API route, we can immediately execute the code just here, which then avoids this extra unnecessary request, which would be sent otherwise. So therefore here, we can again import Mongo client from MongoDB and then connect to it here. Now, when you import something here in a page component file, and that something is then only used in getServerSideProps or getStaticProps, the imported package will not be part of the client-side bundle. So you can import code here, which will then only be executed on the server, and Next.js will detect this and not include it in your client-side bundle, which is good both for bundle size considerations as well as for security. So you can import both server-side and client-side code here, and depending on where you use it, it will be included in different bundles, which are independent from each other. That's a nice, smart feature built into Next.js. And therefore, with Mongo client imported here, we can use it in getStaticProps to again connect. And now we can go to the API route and get rid of Meetups.js there, by the way. And in new Meetup.js, we can now in the end copy this code for establishing the connection, getting access to the database, and getting access to a collection here. We could therefore also refactor this and outsource it into a separate function to avoid copying this. But here, to be very explicit about which code you can execute where, I will copy it and paste it here into getStaticProps. With that, we do connect here. And then once we did connect, and once we did reach out to the Meetups collection, we can use the Meetups collection to call the find method there. And find will by default find all the documents in that collection. It's an async task returning a promise, which we can await here, because I'm using the async keyword here. And then ultimately we'll therefore get our meetups here. To be precise, we should call toArray here after find so that we get back an array of documents. Then we have this array of meetups, and the meetups here, which I set in my props, could now be the meetups which I'm fetching from MongoDB. We can then also, of course, close the connection again once we're done fetching data from MongoDB before we return. And if we do that and reload this all meetups page, we get this error. This error is related to the auto-generated ID. As you can see, it's not a string, it's this strange object ID thing, and that turns out to be a more complex object which can't be returned as data just like this. Therefore, what we actually need to do here is the meetups which we're getting from the database, we want to map this array so that we transform every meetup a little bit, and we return an object here for every meetup where we have a title, which is meetup.title, where we have an address, which is meetup.address, where we have an image, which is meetup.image, and where we have our description maybe, though we actually don't need this here, so we can avoid description for this component because we're not outputting the description anyways on this all meetups page. But we do also add an ID field, not underscore ID, but just ID like this, because I'm using just ID like this in my front-end components. And we set this equal to meetup._ID to string. And this will then convert this object to a string which is usable. And if we convert our data like this and save everything, you will see that if we reload the starting page, this works and we see our meetups again, but that's now actually a list of meetups based on the meetup data we have in our MongoDB database, not our dummy meetups anymore. And I can prove this if I remove my dummy meetups array here. If I remove this array entirely from this index.js file, everything will still work fine if we reload this starting page. So now we are pre-rendering this page with data that's actually coming from a database. And all this code will execute whenever this page is pre-generated. So not for every incoming request, because it's not getServerSideProps, but getStaticProps, but therefore during the build process and when we revalidate, then this page will be pre-rendered and this code will run again. So now we also execute server-side code in getStaticProps. And I can't emphasize enough that this is a standard way of doing it. This code will not end up in the client-side bundle. Your credentials will not be exposed. The bundle will not be bloated. This code will execute when this page is pre-generated. Now for the meetup detail page, we also want to fetch data from the database now. For a specific meetup that was selected, but also for determining which paths should be generated. So which meetup IDs should be supported. Because after all, we do only have a limited list of meetups with specific IDs here. So we want to pre-generate all the paths for all those IDs which we have here. And therefore we will again need to connect to MongoDB. So for this, from index.js, I will again copy this connection code. And again, you could refactor therefore if you wanted to avoid duplication. And I will import Mongo client here from MongoDB like this in the meetup ID index.js file. And then here we can start with getStaticPaths. In there, I want to connect to my database and get access to the meetups collection. And then now here I want to get all the meetup data. So for this, I get my meetups by again awaiting meetups collection.find. Find gives me access to all the meetups. Now actually here I'm only interested in the IDs, and therefore we can tweak find and pass an empty object as a first argument. Here we could define our filter criteria if we want to not find all documents but filter for certain field values. But I do want to find all here, hence we use an empty object, which means give me all the objects. I have no filter criteria. But then we can pass a second argument where we can define which fields should be extracted for every document. And by default, all the fields will be returned. so all the field values, title, image, and so on. But if we're only interested in the ID, we can also add _ID here and set this to 1, which means only include the ID, but no other field values. And with that, we're only fetching the IDs. So we fetch the document objects, but they each will only contain the ID, nothing else. Now again, we should call toArray here to convert this to a JavaScript array of objects. And now we got our meetups here. And now we can generate the paths dynamically. Instead of hard coding this array, we can use meetups here and then map every meetup item, which is a document with an ID, into an object, because paths should be an array of objects, where every object has this params key, just as we have it down there. And then we have a nested object in there, where we define our meetup ID values. And the values for meetup ID should now be our IDs here. So here we can then access meetup, so this parameter, which map gives us automatically, dot _ID to string, like that. And now get rid of this array here. With that, we're generating our array of paths dynamically. And as a result, if I now save this, if we reload the starting page, if we click on Show Details, we're taken to the page for this specific object, for this specific meetup. And you see this cryptic ID here, which is this auto-generated ID MongoDB generated for us. So that's working. But we're not yet fetching the data dynamically here. I want to do that as well. For this, first of all, I'll close the connection here. It isn't a bad idea to do that once we're done. And then I'll copy this code from getStaticPaths and add it here after we got the meetup ID instead of logging the ID. I'll again connect and get access to the collection. Again, we could outsource this into a function if we wanted to. And then here I want to get access to a single meetup, not to all the meetups, just a single meetup. So I want to get access to my selected meetup here. And we do this by using the meetups collection and then using the find_one method. Find_one finds one single document. And to find one, we need to pass an object where we define how to filter, how to search for that document. On this object, you can pass your field names like title, image, address, or description as keys, and then the values for which you want to search as values. So we could pass title of first meetup as a key value pair into this object here to find this first meetup where the title is a first meetup. Now here we don't want to search by title, but instead by ID. So I want to make sure that _ID, the automatically added and generated ID field, has a value of meetup ID. So this meetup ID, which we extract from the params up there. This then finds us this single meetup. This returns a promise because it's an asynchronous task, and hence we should await this and make sure that we added async in front of the function. Whoops. And with that, we got the selected meetup eventually. And now it's the selected meetup which I return here as meetup data, like this. And if we do that and save everything, if I reload this meetup here, it should load successfully and it should display all the data. Now, at the moment, the data I'm showing here, however, is still hard-coded in the JSX code. And now it's finally time to use our props data here, so the actual fetch data in the JSX code as well. For this, we're exposing the meetup data prop to the component, and hence here we should accept props and use that data here. So that for image, I'm passing in props.image, and for the title, we pass in props.title, and so on. Same for the address, that's props.address, and for description, it's props.description. And actually not props dot, but props.meetupData dot, because we have that meetup data prop this prop, which holds the Meetup item, the Meetup object. So we need to drill into that Meetup data object first before we can access image, title, address, and description. Now, once we did all of that, there's one other thing we need to do though, which I just noticed. Here for find one, I'm looking for an ID which is equal to the ID I'm getting out of my URL, but that of course will be a string. Keep in mind that in MongoDB actually, our IDs are these strange object ID things. To ensure that we can correctly look for a specific ID, we need to convert it from string to such an object ID thing. And for this, from MongoDB, you should import object ID like this, with a lowercase d at the end, and wrap your string with that. So down here, wrap object ID around Meetup ID, and this will convert this string into such an object ID object. And once that is done, we also want to go to selected Meetup and make sure that there we convert this ID, this underscore ID field back to a string, because otherwise we'll get that serialization error we saw before. So for this, I'll set Meetup data actually to an object where I do add an ID field, which is equal to selected Meetup dot underscore ID dot toString, and where I then add all the other data like selected Meetup dot title, then the address, which is selected Meetup dot address, then the image, which is selected Meetup dot image, and then also last but not least, the description, which is selected Meetup dot description. And with all that done, if we now save this, if you reload a single Meetup page, you see the data for that single Meetup. And that works for all the Meetups now. And now these Meetup detail pages are pre-rendered on the server dynamically with our code being active and with our code establishing that database connection and fetching the data from there. Now, with all our pages finished and with all that data being fetched and used, and with us being able to add a new Meetup here, with that we added all the functionality that I wanted to add to this demo project, and with that we also used all those core Next.js features. File-based routing, API routes, and of course also page pre-rendering with data fetching, for example with getStaticProps. Now that this app is finished, what's missing? Well, we want to deploy it. We don't just want to have it here locally on our local machine with that development server, but instead we want to deploy it, put it onto a remote machine so that users from all over the world can visit our application. Now, therefore, we are going to deploy it, but before we do that, there is one thing we should also do. One thing you should double check for any kind of Next.js project you're building or for any kind of web project in general. And that's metadata, which you might want to add to your pages. The content is there on our pages. We do have the content visible on the screen. And that's the most important part, of course. But at this point, we haven't added any metadata. If we inspect the rendered HTML code, the head section is relatively empty. We do have some meta tags here, but we are missing the description meta tag, which would be important for search engines. I'm talking about the description meta tag, which allows you to set descriptions which, for example, show up on Google search here. And we're also missing a page title, which is why here in the tab title, we only see the address as a title. And if our pages would show up as search results later, we also want a title, like in this case here, Academind for my own website. So setting such meta tags, adding such head elements, that is something we definitely also want to do when we build a site, and that is something which we want to do here as well. And adding such head elements to our pages is thankfully very simple with Next.js. Let's start on the index.js page, so the home page. There, we definitely want to set some title, and we definitely also want to add a description. And to do that, we can import a special component offered by Next.js, the head component imported from next/head. This is a component which allows you to add head elements to the head section of your page. How do you use it? You simply add it to your returned JSX code. So here, next to the meetup list, I want to add the head element, the head component, and since adjacent JSX code is not allowed, I will use the React fragment imported from React. Here is the import, imported from React. I'll use fragment to wrap head and meetup list. And now inside of these head tags here, between the opening and closing head component tag, there you can now insert your head elements. So all the HTML elements which you can add in the head section, you can add them here. Like for example, the title. And then we could give this page a title of React Meetups or whatever title we want to have here. And actually make sure that this is returned like this. If we then save this and we visit our starting page, you will notice that now here in the tab title, we see that title which I set here. And of course, we also see this in the page source code. There we'll be able to find the title in the head section. Here it is. And we also see that if we open the DevTools and inspect the rendered elements here, here's our title as well. So that's how we can add a title. And that's how we can also add this meta tag, which holds the description, which will be picked up by search engines like Google. Browse a huge list of highly active React meetups. That could be our meta description for this page. And that would be the text which shows up when our page shows up as a result on a search engine, for example. So with that added, we now added some metadata, some head data to this starting page. And we can do this on all the pages. On the new meetup page, for example, I don't just want to return the new meetup form, but also add the fragment here, imported from React, of course. And then between the fragment opening and closing tags, have our adjacent JSX code to have the head section there and the new meetup form. Head is of course a component which we also need to import now. So import head from next head like this. And now here we can set a title as well, like add a new meetup. And we can also update the description and change this to add your own meetups, create amazing networking opportunities, like this. So now this is added here as well. And hence, if we visit the Add New Meetup page, we see our title here. And of course, in the DevTools, we also see this description meta tag here in the head section. Now, last but not least, we also want to set a title and show a description if we view a single meetup. And therefore, we should also go to this single meetup ID page and also wrap this into a fragment here and add this head component and bring the meetup detail into this fragment as well. And then, of course, make sure that you import fragment from React and import head from next/head, like this. And then here, between the opening and closing head tags, we can also add a title. And of course here, the title will not be a static, hard-coded title, as it is on the other pages, where it's always the same title. But instead here, for a single loaded meetup item on that meetup details page, here I actually want to use the title of that meetup as a title for this page, so that different meetups have different titles on their pages. And hence, different meetups showing up on a search engine would show up with different titles and descriptions there as well. And making this title dynamic instead of static is super simple. After all, we are in our regular returned JSX code snippet block. So we can use all the standard React features here and, for example, output the result of a dynamic expression with curly braces. And then output props.metadata.title as a title here. And then add this meta tag here for the description, and a content of some content. And then here, make the content dynamic and output props.metadata.description, for example, or whatever you want to output as a description. And therefore, we can set a hard-coded description as we do it on the add a new Meetup page, for example, but we can also set a dynamic value as we're doing it here. And with that, if we save this and reload this page, this single Meetup page, we see that title here in the tab. And if we inspect this here, in the head section, we also see the title and we see this description with the actual Meetup description text. And now with that, we really prepared our page for deployment, our website for deployment, because with that, we make sure that search engines get all that extra metadata, and we also show our users some nice titles here as well. And with that, let's now deploy this site. Now, when it comes to deploying Next.js apps, there are different hosting providers you can use. And there are different ways of configuring your project as well. You can, for example, use environment variables, for example, to hold things like your database credentials. I'll not dive into that here. I do in my full Next.js course though. But for this example here, we'll just keep the credentials stored here in this code. And from a security perspective, this is fine, by the way, because this code will never end up on the client. It just might be inconvenient to use one and the same database and one and the same user for development and for production, but for this demo, this does not matter. So I'll stick to this approach here. And regarding the hosting provider, I will use Vercel. Vercel is a great hosting provider for Next.js applications because Vercel actually is a hosting provider by the same team that developed Next.js. So it's really embracing Next.js and optimized for Next.js, if you want to put it like this. And deploying Next.js applications to Vercel is thankfully also extremely simple. Now, what you'll need to do to start deploying is sign up with a Git repository provider. Because with Vercel, you will directly link your GitHub repository, which holds your source code, for example, to Vercel, and they will then get your source code from that repository and deploy it for you. Therefore, you need to use GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket, which are Git repository providers, to put your code there before you can deploy it with Vercel. Now here I will use GitHub, which arguably is the biggest and most popular Git repository provider, and I already did log in with my account here. Once you did create an account and log in, it's free, you can create a new repository. And you can give this repository any name you want, like Next.js course demo or anything like this. You can also give it a description and then choose whether it should be public or private. If it's public, everyone can see it, everyone can see your code. If it's private, only people you grant access to can view it. And I'll go with private here, but either of the options can be correct. It simply depends on which kind of project it is. If it's an open source project, it will probably be public. So I'll go with private and create my repository. Once that is created, you need to push your code here. Now for that, you need to install Git on your local system, and you can get Git from git-scm.com. It's available for all operating systems. You can download the installer from there and simply walk through it to install Git on your system. And once you installed Git on your local system, you can create a so-called commit in your project, a code snapshot, you could say, and then push that commit, that repository as a whole actually, to GitHub, to move your code with your code history to GitHub. Now, I won't turn this course into a Git course. If you want to learn more about Git and GitHub, we got a standalone course on that which you can take. Here, I will assume that you have those Git basics and that you have Git installed now. And if you have it installed, you can then go back into your local project, into your project folder, and create a code snapshot, a commit as it's called. You do this by running git add dot, and you can run this if you got Git installed, and then git commit and then some message of your choice. For example, ready for deployment, though typically you want to add commit messages that describe what you changed. But with that, I now created such a snapshot, such a commit, and now we're ready for deployment. Now that means that now we need to push our code to GitHub. For this, we can grab this URL here, which will point to the repository we created, and in our local project folder, run git remote add origin and paste that URL in here. Now, depending on whether you worked with Git and GitHub before or not, you might want to add your GitHub username here in front of github.com. If you did work with GitHub before and pushed before, you probably don't need to do that. But if you never pushed anything to GitHub, adding this will ensure that you're prompted for your password and that you have a chance of entering your credentials. Because of course you'll need to authenticate yourselves in order to successfully push to this repository. You can't just start pushing to some random repositories which you don't own. So therefore here, I will now add this origin here, and then run git push -- all. And this will now push our code here. Now you might be prompted for your password here, and you can then enter your GitHub password or use a token for authentication. For this, to generate such a token, you need to go to your GitHub settings, and then there, go to developer settings, personal access tokens, and generate a new token here. Once you confirm this with your password, you can add some node here like Next.js deployment or a more general purpose. And then under scopes, select repo, delete repo, and admin repo hook here. And then generate a token. And now you'll need to copy that token here, which is showing up here, and enter this as a password when you're prompted for it. Once you did all of that and you pushed successfully, you should see your code in this repository which you just created in the main branch. And now we can link this repository to Vercel to start deploying. Now before we do that, let me talk about building for production and what Vercel actually does. Vercel is a hosting provider which you can not just use for Next.js, you can also use them for other projects, but which definitely is optimized for Next.js. So whilst you can host other things there as well, and it might be optimized for those other types of projects as well, it is definitely optimized for Next.js. And that means that you can just connect Vercel to your GitHub repository, and Vercel will build and then deploy and start your project for you. So you don't need to run any build command on your own, Vercel will do that for you. Nonetheless, I want to show you what Vercel does. And therefore I'm back in our local code here. And there in package.json, we see a couple of scripts, which are commands we can execute in this project. We worked a lot with the dev script to start this development server, and that is the script which we use during local development. But we can also run the build script to build our project for production, so to optimize all our code, minify it, and so on. And you want to run this if you do deploy it on another host which does not build the project for you. So we don't need to do it with Vercel, but you might need to do it for other hosting providers. And then once you run this command, this will give you a .next folder which contains some of these optimized files. For example, this .next folder will also contain all those pre-generated page files, those HTML files for your pages, like the starting page here, or the individual Meetup detail pages. So this is what npm run build will do for you. And Vercel will execute this command on our behalf on their servers. So we don't need to do that. But if you would host your project on another server, which you manage yourself, for example, you need to run npm run build, and thereafter, with npm start, you can start a production server. So now again, we have a running server, but this is now the production server, which you could start on a remote machine which you administer yourself to run the server for your next application. And that server therefore should of course stay up and running on that machine to which you deployed your application as long as you want to expose it to the world. Now, we'll quit it here though. Now all of that will be done by Vercel. And therefore let's now go back to Vercel and continue with GitHub here. And now here we'll need to link GitHub to Vercel. Now you are then prompted to give Vercel certain permissions, give it access to your repositories, and I'll do that here. And once you did that, you can select that repository, which we created a couple of minutes ago here, and connect it to Vercel. So I'll click import here on that repository. Now we'll select this personal account here. You might be prompted to create an account here, and there you want to choose the personal one, which is free to use or free to get started. Definitely check out their pricing pages to learn more about the different options you have there. And with that, we now can configure how our code should be pulled and how the project should be built. And all the defaults here typically should work for you. It detected that it's a Next.js project, the default build and output settings work for us, and we could override environment variables here if we would be using any, but we aren't, and hence we can just click deploy. Now to ensure that it really works, we'll also need to go to MongoDB Atlas and change something here. There, under network access, you will need to make sure that you allow access from anywhere. This ensures that the Vercel servers on which our application will run will be able to connect to MongoDB. Otherwise, this will fail and our data can't be loaded and stored. So we need to grant this access. We still, of course, use our credentials for actually establishing the connection, but we need to open up that global access to allow Vercel and its servers, and our code running on their servers, to connect to MongoDB. Now it can take a while until this operation is done, so let's wait for this. And once it's done, here we actually see an error that connection failed because I just changed it after starting the deploy. But we can simply hit deploy again and start a new deploy, which should now succeed because now we did open up MongoDB for outside access. So let's now wait whether that now starts up successfully here. It definitely built our site successfully here, that's good. And that is looking good. Now we can click visit and we see our site up and running on Vercel's servers here. We can also try adding a meetup here. Test Street 5, this is a test, and see whether that works. And it does. It might not show up immediately on this page, because this page is statically generated and then only revalidated once every second for incoming requests. And then it needs to be pre-generated again, so even after 1 second it might not show up immediately. But eventually we see our new meetup here. And we can't visit it here though. We get a 404 error here. And that's actually an expected error at this point. What's the problem here? The problem here is that on the single meetup page, we do specify which meetup pages should be pre-generated, and we only set this at build time and never thereafter. And since we set fallback to false, we also ensure that any requests to meetups for which no page was pre-generated before will fail. Now that worked as long as we didn't add a new meetup, and it worked during development because there the getStaticPaths function ran for every incoming request, but it now fails after deployment. Now fixing it is quite simple though, thankfully. We can set fallback to true, or even better, to blocking. When you set fallback to true or to blocking, you're telling Next.js that the list of paths which you're specifying here might not be exhaustive. There might be more valid pages. And therefore, when fallback is set to true or to blocking, Next.js will not respond with a 404 page if it can't find the page immediately. Instead, with fallback set to true or blocking, it will then generate that page on demand and thereafter cache it, so it will pre-generate it when needed. Now, the difference between true and blocking then is that with true, it would immediately return an empty page and then pull down the dynamically generated content once that's done. So you need to handle that case that the page does not have the data yet. With blocking, the user will not see anything until the page was pre-generated and the finished page will be served. And that's the approach I will use here, since it doesn't require any other extra work from our side. So if we change fallback to blocking, we'll not face this problem anymore. Now we just need to redeploy this, and for this all we have to do is create a new code snapshot with git add, and then with git commit, where we say fixed fallback or something like this, and then simply push our branch again, push our repository back onto GitHub. And the great thing is that Next.js will actually watch this main branch to which we pushed, and whenever it detects a change there, it will automatically start building and redeploying. As you can see here, it's building already again. So that's very convenient. If you want to update your page and redeploy, all you have to do is create a new commit and push it to your connected GitHub repository. And that will then automatically trigger a redeployment. And whilst it's redeploying, your old page will stay up and running, but once it's done, the new page will take over. And hence now, this meetup exists here. And if we add another meetup here with this image and our test address and some test text, if we do this, now our change should also be in effect. And if we now reload the starting page a couple of times to revalidate it, if we now visit this meetup, it's created on the fly, and this also works. And that is also something which I wanted to show you, especially combined with that redeployment feature, which is also something you should know. Now, there is of course more you can do. You can connect a custom domain here, and you can also configure more in your project. There are more features which you can add as well, but I mentioned this before already. There are simply more things which you could add. This tutorial, however, had the goal of giving you an overview of the most important features, and therefore we're now finished with that. And now that is it for this tutorial. That's it for this summary about Next.js. Now, Next.js has more to offer. There are more configuration options for getStaticProps and what you can return there. There also are ways of optimizing images with the built-in Next image component. You can also easily add authentication and add users sign up and log in and log out and manage sessions with Next.js. All of that is possible. It's very powerful, and all these are things we're going to take a look at in my full Next course. This course here, this tutorial, had the goal of summarizing the core Next.js features and had the goal of introducing you to Next.js. And I hope it's now clear what Next.js is and why using it might be interesting, how it can simplify building complex React apps, how you can work with pages here, including dynamic pages, how pages are pre-rendered, and how you can fetch data for pre-rendering with getStaticProps or getServerSideProps. That for dynamic pages, you also need getStaticPaths to tell Next.js which specific instances of this dynamic page should be pre-rendered. and how you can run your own server-side code in there, like here, where we are connecting to a database. You also learned about API routes, so that it's not just about fetching data all the time, but that you can include your own REST API as part of this React project. And you can add your server-side code here, your own API code, to which you then can send requests from inside your client-side application, like we're doing it here for storing a new meetup. And that's Next.js, a super powerful framework for React, which adds many nice features which can really make your life easier and which can help you solve problems which you're actually facing in a lot of React projects.